Before there were kingdoms, there was the North Sea. Cold, gray, and endless, it moved like a living creature, breathing fog across the low coasts of what would one day be called Friesland. The sea decided everything here: when to plant, when to fish, when to flee. It could give life, and it could take it away in a single high tide. Those who stayed learned to read its moods, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the deep quiet that came just before the waves rose higher than the dikes. The Frisians were not born masters of the sea. They became so because the sea left them no other choice. Their homeland was a strange, shifting border between land and water. Wide marshes, slow rivers, islands of peat and sand that changed shape with every season. To survive, the Frisians raised the earth itself into mounds called turpen, building their homes atop these man-made hills so the floods would pass beneath them. From a distance, their villages looked like islands floating in mist, tiny beacons of firelight surrounded by the breathing sea. The people who lived there grew strong backs and quiet patience. They learned to build dikes from clay and reeds, to herd cattle on grass salted by the wind, and to keep faith in themselves when the horizon vanished under rain. Because the land gave so little, they looked outward, to the water. The Frisians became sailors almost as soon as they became farmers. Their flat-bottomed boats slid through shallow channels that only they could navigate. In summer they traded hides, amber, and wool. In winter they repaired their ships and listened to the wind tell stories of distant places. The sea made them restless, but also proud. They carried with them a belief that no man could truly own another, for the sea belonged to everyone and to no one. Along the long curve of the North Sea coast, their settlements spread like pearls on a string, from modern Friesland through Groningen, East Frisia, and up toward Denmark. Their speech had the same rhythm as the surf, soft and musical, close in sound to the Old English of the islands across the water. Traders from far ports soon learned that to deal with a Frisian was to bargain with someone who knew the worth of every tide. Silver from the Frankish lands, furs from the north, wine from the Rhine, glass from the south, all passed through Frisian hands. Long before the Hanseatic League or the merchants of Lubeck, it was these quiet sailors who tied northern Europe together. Yet even as their ships carried wealth, their hearts carried freedom. They had no kings, no castles, no lords who demanded fealty. When disputes arose, men gathered in open fields beneath the wide sky and spoke the law aloud. The decisions made there bound them more tightly than chains ever could, because they were chosen together. This sense of shared rule, the Frisian freedom, became their shield against every empire that tried to claim them. It was a promise whispered in the roar of the waves. We will be free as long as the sea is ours. At night the wind swept over the dikes, rattling the shutters and filling the dark with its endless voice. Families sat by the hearth listening to tales of storm gods, sea spirits, and brave sailors lost beyond the horizon. Each story ended the same way, not with triumph, but with endurance. The Frisians did not dream of empires. They dreamed of surviving the next tide. And in that quiet strength, they found something eternal, a way of life carved not in stone or law, but in the heartbeats of those who dared to live between land and sea. As dawn broke over the misty coastline, sails began to appear along the horizon, broad, square sails made of wool, dyed with the faint colors of ochre and flax. These were the ships of the Frisians, sturdy and low to the water, gliding through the shallows where larger vessels dared not go. They had no grand fleets or imperial navies, but their skill turned every river mouth and coastal bay into a gateway for trade. In the early Middle Ages, when roads were few and forests thick, the sea was the only road that mattered, and on that road, the Frisians were masters. They traveled wherever the winds would take them, across the narrow sea to England, up the winding rivers of France, and northward into the cold fjords of Scandinavia. Their ships carried wool, salt, fish, and furs, but more than that, they carried news. The Frisians became the messengers of the North Sea world, bringing stories and goods between lands that barely knew of each other's existence. To the English monks of the 7th century, they were both friends and rivals, traders who arrived with amber from Jutland, honey from the forests, and silver from the distant Frankish realms. To the Norse, they were fellow sailors, kin in spirit if not in name. The Frisian settlements grew into bustling ports, Dorstad, Emden, Stavern, and others now lost beneath the waves. There, merchants haggled over spices and slaves, textiles and tin. The air was thick with the smell of tar and fish, the clang of hammers repairing ships, and the hum of voices speaking half a dozen tongues. Dorstad, especially, became the jewel of the North Sea, a city where Frisian traders brushed shoulders with Frankish counts and Viking raiders. For a time, it seemed that nothing could challenge their dominance. Their ships were swift, their routes secure, and their spirit untamed. But the sea gives, and the sea takes away. In the 9th century, the North Sea world began to tremble under the shadow of a new power, the Vikings. From Denmark and Norway came longships faster and deadlier than any before, their sails red as blood against the gray sky. The Frisians, once the boldest sailors of the north, now found themselves pursued across the very waters they had ruled. Villages were burned, monasteries looted, and ports like Dorstad were plundered again and again. The age of peaceful trade turned suddenly to one of survival. Yet even in this darkness, the Frisians endured. When the Franks under Charlemagne extended their empire northward, they met not a defeated people but a stubborn one. The Frisians fought fiercely, unwilling to kneel. One chronicler wrote that the sea itself seemed to rise against the emperor, as if the tides refused to yield to the march of Rome's heirs. Though Charlemagne eventually conquered the region, he could never fully tame it. The Frisians accepted baptism and law, but not bondage. In their hearts, they still belonged to the sea. Their independence lived on in the Frisian freedom, a system of self-rule that survived even under imperial banners. No feudal lords ruled their villages. No castles loomed over their fields. Justice was spoken in open-air assemblies called tings, where free men gathered to settle disputes and pass judgment. It was said that each Frisian is his own king, and though this was never entirely true, it carried a powerful truth of spirit. Their freedom was not granted by sword or crown. It was carved from the salt of the sea and the memory of survival. And so, through storm and conquest, the Frisians remained, quietly, steadily, endlessly. Their sails became rarer as the centuries turned, but their spirit did not fade. Even as the Hanseatic League rose and other powers claimed the sea, the Frisians still lived between the tides, speaking their soft language, building their dikes, and remembering. The age when they were the traders of the north, the invisible empire of wind and water. The Frisians had always believed the sea was their only ruler. But now, from the south, another power approached, one not of wind and waves, but of banners and steel. The Franks, led by a king whose ambitions stretched as far as the horizon itself, Charlemagne. His empire sought to unite Christendom, to bring all of Europe under the cross and crown. And to him, the Frisians, proud, pagan, and free, were an unfinished chapter in his conquest of the north. At first, the conflict came like a tide, slowly rising, then impossible to stop. Frankish armies marched north, their standards shining with the golden cross, their monks carrying relics and holy water. The Frisians, used to fighting storms and not empires, gathered their warriors on the dikes and marshes. Spears glinted in the morning fog, shields painted with crude runes and sea symbols. They fought not for conquest, but for what their fathers had always known, the right to live by their own law beneath the endless sky. In those early years, the wars were fierce and uncertain. The Frisians struck swiftly, using their knowledge of tides and terrain to ambush the heavy Frankish cavalry. But Charlemagne's reach was long. For every battle the Frisians won, the Franks returned stronger, building forts, converting villages, taking hostages. Some chieftains submitted, swearing fealty for peace. Others vanished into the northern swamps, continuing the fight as ghosts of rebellion. Legends tell of Radbod, the Frisian king who defied the Franks to his final breath. When a priest offered him baptism, Radbod asked if his ancestors were in heaven. No, the priest replied. They dwell in hell, for they died unbaptized. Radbod paused, looked toward the sea, and said quietly, Then I choose hell with my people. With that, he refused the faith of the Franks, and with him, the last true Frisian king disappeared into legend. Yet history is not made only by kings. The common Frisians endured. When Charlemagne's legions finally conquered the coast, they did not break its people, they adapted. Churches rose where temples once stood, Latin prayers replaced ancient songs, but beneath the new words, the old spirit still lived. The Frisians obeyed the empire, but only outwardly. In their hearts, they remained loyal to their freedom, their law, and the sea. Even Charlemagne, in his wisdom, understood that to rule the Frisians was to leave them somewhat untamed. He granted them certain privileges, rights that no other subjects enjoyed. Their land was dangerous, their people stubborn, but their ships were invaluable. The emperor needed their ports and sailors to guard the coasts, to trade, to connect his vast empire by sea. And so a fragile peace was born, one built not on submission, but on quiet compromise. When the emperor died in 814, his empire began to fracture, and the Frisians, once again, found themselves between powers. To the west, the Franks argued among themselves for inheritance. To the north, the Vikings came again, swift and merciless. Frisian towns like Dorstad were burned and rebuilt, again and again, until even memory seemed to sink beneath the ashes. The empire that had once claimed them began to forget them, and in that forgetfulness, they found their freedom again. They returned to their old ways, trading, sailing, meeting in open assemblies. They had no king, no standing army, no grand castles, only the shared belief that law was something spoken between equals. In the sagas of the north, the Frisians became symbols of endurance, those who live where the sea does not rest. Their lives were hard, but they were unbroken. And so, while the world changed around them, while empires rose and vanished like foam, the Frisians stayed. Not powerful, not wealthy, not dominant, but free. The sea was still their home, their border, and their judge. When the shadow of Charlemagne finally faded across the northern coast, something extraordinary began to take shape in its wake. The Frisians, left to their marshlands and windswept islands, began to build not an empire, but a covenant, a living promise among themselves. It was called the Frisian freedom, and though it had no crown, no written constitution, and no fortress to guard it, it was perhaps the most powerful thing they ever created. In the centuries that followed, as kings fought over thrones and nobles raised armies, the Frisians gathered in open meadows under wide skies. There were no golden halls, only the sound of gulls and the wind carrying voices over the grass. Free men came from every village, farmers, sailors, traders, elders, to speak for their families and their land. They sat together in the open, judging disputes, deciding taxes, and crafting laws that belonged to no master but themselves. It was a democracy before the word existed, and it thrived on the simple, stubborn belief that freedom could survive without a king. Their laws, passed down through word and memory, were as intricate as the tides they lived beside. They balanced justice and mercy, custom and change, as carefully as they balanced their dikes against the sea. In a world ruled by armored lords and endless wars, the Frisians were different. They were guided not by swords, but by words. Every man's voice carried weight. Every decision was made beneath the open sky. It was said that the Frisians bow only to God, and even He, they believed, understood their fierce love of liberty. But this freedom was not without danger. Without a king, they were vulnerable to every power that coveted their coast, the Franks, the Danes, the Saxons, the Counts of Holland. Yet somehow they endured. The same geography that made their life hard also protected them. The marshes, tides, and shifting sands were natural fortresses, deadly to cavalry, treacherous to armies, known only to those who had been born upon them. When invaders came, they found not cities to conquer, but a labyrinth of water and will. Trade flourished once more. Frisian merchants sailed to England, Flanders, and Norway, their ships loaded with salt, herring, wool, and grain. The old ports revived, and new towns rose along the coast. Harlingen, Leeuwarden, Groningen, each one a small heartbeat in the great network of northern trade. Though they lacked the power of the great Hanseatic cities, they matched them in skill and spirit. To the merchants of Lübeck and Hamburg, the Frisians were both competitors and kindred souls, seafarers shaped by the same northern winds. Their freedom became legend. Chroniclers wrote of them with awe and sometimes envy. They called the Frisians the free folk of the north, people who needed no king to tell them what was right. In their courts, known as Upstulsboom, envoys from across the Frisian lands met each year to renew their oath of unity, not to a ruler, but to each other. Beneath the branches of a great oak near Auric, they swore to uphold justice, to defend their land, and to remain free. For centuries, that simple oath bound them together stronger than any crown. Still, even freedom has its storms. The world was changing, cities were growing, money was replacing barter, and the sea itself was shifting. Great floods swallowed entire villages, and new rulers watched the Frisian coast with greedy eyes. Yet through it all, they remained, mending their dikes, rebuilding their homes, and teaching their children the stories of their ancestors. Freedom, they knew, was not a gift. It was something that had to be rebuilt again and again, like the land itself, reclaimed from the sea, held together by courage and care. And in that endless cycle of loss, survival, and renewal, the true heart of the Frisians beat on. For the Frisians, the sea was not only a source of life, it was also a silent enemy. It gave them fish, trade, and salt, yet it could take everything away in a single night. No empire, no army, no king could humble them as deeply as the water that surrounded their land. And so, across the centuries, their greatest battles were not fought with swords, but with shovels, spades, and faith. The land they called home was fragile, low and shifting, built upon mud and silt where rivers met the sea. Every storm was a test of courage. In the distance, the horizon would darken, the wind would rise, and the sound of the waves would grow into a deep, rolling thunder. Families gathered behind their dikes, praying that the earth beneath them would hold. The sea clawed at the walls, the rain fell in sheets, and the night would glow with lightning as if the gods themselves were striking the coast. When dawn came, the survivors would walk out into silence. The land changed, the fields gone, the bodies of cattle and kin carried away by the tide. Yet every time the sea took, the Frisians rebuilt. They carved new dikes, dug new channels, raised their homes higher on terps, great mounds of earth that rose like islands above the floods. Generations lived and died upon those mounds, always listening for the sea's return. To them, the battle was eternal, not a war to win, but a rhythm to endure. The sea was a force to be respected, not conquered. They did not hate it, they lived with it. The Frisians came to see themselves as a people chosen by the tides, those who survived where others would drown. In time, this relationship between land, water, and spirit became almost sacred. The Frisians believed their survival was proof of divine favor. They built small churches on their terps, humble and low to the ground, their bells sounding softly through the fog. When the storms came, they gathered inside, praying as the waves broke against the dikes. They sang hymns in the old tongue, songs that mixed Christian faith with whispers of older, forgotten beliefs, of sea spirits, wind gods, and ancestors watching from the waves. It was as though heaven and the sea shared the same horizon. Chroniclers wrote of the great floods that marked their history. The first St. Marcellus flood of 1219, when tens of thousands drowned. The second Marcellus flood of 1362, when entire villages vanished beneath the North Sea, leaving only church spires visible above the water. They called it the Groot Man Drank, the great drowning of men. For the Frisians, These were not just disasters. They were reminders of the delicate balance of existence. Their freedom was built upon the edge of chaos, and their faith grew stronger each time the waves retreated. Outsiders wondered how they could endure it, why they did not move inland, away from the danger. But the Frisians could no more abandon the sea than they could abandon themselves. The water was part of their blood, their work, their rhythm. Their children learned from an early age to read the tides, to mend the dikes, to listen to the whisper of the wind across the marshes. Every flood left scars, but also wisdom. Every storm taught them how to survive the next. And so, the Frisians became both builders and believers, craftsmen of the land, guardians of the coast, and keepers of a fragile peace between nature and man. They learned that freedom was not a gift from kings or gods, but something earned every day, in the mud, in the wind, in the endless labor to keep their world above the waterline. The sea would always be waiting, but so would they. By the 13th century, the winds of Europe were changing. Cities were rising, markets were expanding, and the hum of commerce echoed louder than the clash of swords. Across the cold waters of the Baltic and the North Sea, a vast network of merchants began to weave together an invisible empire of trade, the Hanseatic League. From Lübeck to Hamburg, from Riga to Bergen, their ships carried salt, grain, timber, and silver, connecting distant worlds through the rhythm of the tides. And within this grand web of trade, the Frisians, those quiet sailors of the coast, found themselves once again at the crossroads of history. Though they were never formally members of the League, the Frisians were essential to its pulse. Their ports, Harlingen, Leeuwarden, Groningen, and the islands beyond, became the resting points for Hanseatic vessels, safe harbors in the restless North Sea. Their merchants spoke many tongues, bargaining with the same calm precision that had made them masters of trade centuries before. While other cities built walls and raised guild halls, the Frisians kept their settlements open and modest, their wealth measured not in stone, but in trust. The Hanseatic merchants respected them, even envied them. For while the League answered to councils and treaties, the Frisians answered to no one. They lived under their own laws, governed by their own assemblies. When disputes arose, they were settled not by judges in robes, but by men standing in the open air, beneath the same sky that covered their ancestors. To the world of bureaucracy and order, they were a reminder of an older kind of freedom, untamed, inconvenient, and deeply human. Their ships, smaller and lighter than the grand cogs of the Hanseatic fleet, became known for their speed and resilience. They carried herring, wool, and butter to Flanders and England, bringing back cloth, wine, and tools. The sea routes they once dominated as raiders and traders now became lifelines for entire nations. And through it all, the Frisians remained who they had always been, quiet, practical, and fiercely proud. They had no ambition for empire, no hunger for domination. They sought only to live by their own measure, in balance with the sea and the sky. But even as their ships filled with goods and gold, something was shifting in the world beyond their marshes. The League grew powerful, and with power came control. Tariffs, monopolies, and treaties began to bind the once open waters of the North Sea. The Frisians, who had traded freely for centuries, now found their independence challenged not by armies, but by laws and signatures. The very thing that had made them great, their freedom, was becoming an obstacle in a world that worshipped order. Still, they adapted. The same resilience that had kept them alive through flood and invasion now guided them through politics and commerce. When the Hanseatic fleets sought to dominate trade, Frisian sailors slipped through the cracks, small, fast, and ungovernable. They traded where others could not, carrying goods quietly from coast to coast, often outside the League's rigid systems. In doing so, they kept alive an ancient tradition. That trade, like the sea itself, belonged to those brave enough to navigate it. Yet beneath this success, the first cracks of change were forming. The age of free men and open assemblies was fading. Nobles and counts began to eye the rich Frisian lands, hungry for control. Foreign rulers, from Holland, from Saxony, from Denmark, spoke softly of protection and order, but what they truly sought was dominion. The Frisians would soon face a new kind of threat, one they could not fight with ships or shovels alone. The tide of freedom was beginning to turn, but the Frisians, as always, would not yield easily. For as the great merchant fleets filled the horizon and kings drew maps in faraway halls, the people of the North Sea whispered their oldest vow beneath the wind. Better to drown in freedom than to live in chains. For centuries, the Frisians had stood apart, a people without a king, a land without castles. But the world around them was changing, hardening. The age of free men was giving way to the age of rulers and lords. Across Europe, noble houses grew rich and restless, binding peasants to their fields and soldiers to their banners. To those who craved control, the idea of Frisian freedom, that a man might stand equal to any count or knight, was an insult. And so, one by one, the powers of the north began to turn their gaze upon the flat, fertile lands by the sea. It began quietly, with promises. The counts of Holland, the bishops of Utrecht, and the dukes of Saxony each claimed distant rights to Frisian soil, old charters, royal decrees, whispers of inheritance written in the language of kings. To the Frisians, these claims were meaningless. Their law was spoken, not written, and their loyalty was bound only to God and the community. But to those who sought control, this very faith in freedom was a weakness to exploit. They sent envoys with soft words and gold, offering protection, trade privileges, and order. The Frisians listened, nodded, and returned to their dikes. And in their silence, the seeds of war began to grow. The 14th and 15th centuries were years of unrest. The great floods had weakened the land, and the endless rivalries among local clans, the Vetkopers and the Schieringers, turned brother against brother. What began as disputes over property and trade soon became full-blown civil wars. Villages burned, alliances shifted with the tides, and the once united voice of the Frisian assemblies fractured into bitter silence. It was in this chaos that the foreign lords saw their chance. The counts of Holland marched north, claiming they came to restore peace. The dukes of Saxony followed, draped in banners of the Holy Roman Empire. One by one, they built fortresses on Frisian soil, stone where there had been none before. The people resisted fiercely, ambushing soldiers in the marshes, refusing to pay tribute, refusing to bow. But the world no longer fought with spears and oaths. It fought with gunpowder and gold. Slowly, painfully, the independence that had survived Charlemagne and the Vikings began to falter. Still, the Frisians would not surrender without a cry. In 1498, when Duke Albert of Saxony was sent by Emperor Maximilian to bring order to Friesland, the people rose in defiance. They met his soldiers not with banners, but with fire, burning bridges, cutting dikes, turning their homeland into a weapon. The fighting was brutal and brief. For every Frisian who fell, another took his place, but the numbers were against them. By the end of that year, the Frisian freedom, that centuries-old covenant of self-rule, was broken. The Duke declared himself ruler of Friesland, and the last free people of the North Sea bowed beneath the weight of empire. And yet, not entirely. Even under Saxon rule, the Frisians remained difficult to govern. They refused to use the noble titles forced upon them. They clung to their assemblies, their language, their way of life. When taxes rose, they rebelled. When soldiers came, they vanished into the marshes. Their spirit had bent, but it had not broken. The conquerors could take their land, but they could not take their soul. The wind still carried the same songs across the dikes, old hymns of storms and saints, of ships and freedom lost, but not forgotten. The fall of the Frisian freedom was not an end. It was a transformation, the passing of a torch from history into memory. The people who had once ruled themselves by the rhythm of the sea now. Visitors to Friesland in later centuries often spoke of the people's calm and dignity. There were no grand castles, no marble palaces, only clean farms, windmills turning lazily in the breeze, and canals stretching like silver threads across the fields. Yet beneath that calm lay a history of resistance older than the nations that surrounded them. They needed no monuments, because their monument was the land itself, a landscape wrestled from the sea by human hands and held together by will. The spirit of the old Frisian freedom lived on in their traditions. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as Europe tore itself apart in wars of religion and power, Friesland remained a place of quiet independence. The people valued fairness, equality, and reason. They distrusted authority, preferring local councils and honest debate over royal decrees. When the Dutch Republic was born, it was said that Friesland's way of governance, its ancient belief in collective decision and mutual respect, helped shape the ideals of the new nation. The Frisians had lost their political autonomy, but they had given something greater in return, the idea that freedom could live not in thrones, but in hearts. Even their relationship with the sea became a symbol of their endurance. Generations of engineers, sailors, and farmers continued the eternal labor of keeping the water at bay. They built the great Afsluitdijk, the massive sea barrier that would one day close the Zuiderzee, fulfilling a dream their ancestors could never have imagined, taming the tides themselves. And yet, even as they conquered the floods with machines and modern walls, they never forgot what the sea had taught them, that nothing is ever truly conquered, only balanced. Today, when the wind sweeps across the northern fields and the gulls cry over the coast, it carries with it echoes of that old world. The shouts of traders in Dorstad, the songs of sailors in wooden ships, the prayers of farmers standing on their dikes. The land is quiet now, the war's long ended, but the soul of the Frisians still hums beneath the surface. They are no longer a people of empire or rebellion, but of memory, a living bridge between the ancient and the modern, between freedom and endurance. And as long as the North Sea continues to breathe against their shores, the story of the Frisians, the free people of the water, will never be truly over. For the tides still whisper their name, and the sea, eternal and watchful, still keeps their secret. The dawn of the modern world brought change to every corner of Europe. Cities grew, empires fell, and the rhythm of life began to quicken with the hum of machines and the glow of industry. Yet, along the windswept shores of the North Sea, in the green expanse of Friesland, time seemed to move differently. The people here still rose with the tide, still watched the skies for storms, and still carried within them the quiet strength of their ancestors. The world beyond might have forgotten the name of the old Frisian freedom, but in the heart of every farmer, sailor, and craftsman, it lived on, not as rebellion, but as a quiet knowing that they were, and would always be, their own. In the villages that the coast, Harlingen, Dockum, Leeuwarden, history lingers like a mist. Narrow streets wind past houses built centuries ago, their facades leaning slightly, weathered by salt and wind. The canals mirror the gray skies, and the scent of the sea drifts through every open door. Children play where ships once launched, their laughter echoing across the same waters that carried Frisian merchants to England and Norway long before Europe had borders. In their schools, they still teach Frisian, a language as old as the tides, soft and melodic, with words that carry the weight of forgotten centuries. In modern times, Friesland has become a region within the Netherlands, yet it remains a world apart. Its people proud of their heritage, their language, and their landscape. Every year, festivals celebrate the old traditions, the sea shanties, the horse races across the frozen lakes, the tales of kings and storms told beside the fire. Fishermen still mend their nets in the harbor, and farmers still tend to the black and white cattle that have grazed here for generations. Progress has come. Wind turbines turn where once windmills stood, ships made of steel glide where wooden ones once sailed. But beneath the surface, nothing essential has changed. There's a stillness to Friesland that is hard to find elsewhere. Perhaps it comes from the endless horizon, the meeting of sky, land, and sea in a single breath. Or perhaps it is born of memory, of centuries spent fighting both nature and empire, and learning that endurance is its own kind of victory. The The Frisians no longer build fleets or defy emperors, but their quiet defiance lives in how they preserve their way of life. They have become stewards of history, guardians of the balance between land and water, tradition and change. And though centuries separate them from the warriors and traders of the early Middle Ages, the connection remains unbroken. When the waves crash against the dikes on a stormy night, it is easy to imagine the voices of the past carried in the wind, the chants of oarsmen, the creak of ships, the murmur of councils gathered beneath torchlight to decide their fate. The land remembers. Every blade of grass, every stretch of reclaimed marsh, every whispering tide is part of a story that began long before written words and continues still, carried not by conquest, but by care. As the stars rise over the North Sea and the world settles into night, the story of the Frisians becomes less about history and more about rhythm. The rhythm of waves, of wind, of human hearts that refuse to be ruled. They remind us that freedom is not always loud or violent. Sometimes it is quiet. It is the steady act of living by one's own code, of holding on to dignity even when the world changes around you. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine the cold northern wind against your skin, the sound of distant gulls, the endless heartbeat of the tide. Somewhere out there, beyond the dunes and the dikes, the sea whispers the same ancient lullaby it once sang to the Frisians, a song of freedom, endurance, and belonging. The people may have changed, the empires may have vanished, but the soul of the sea remains. And in that eternal sound, their story lives on. The story of a people who were never conquered, not truly. Because freedom, once born, never dies. It only changes its shape, like the tide. Long before the first chronicles spoke their name, before emperors or saints or swords carved borders into the earth, there were people who lived between land and sea. They built their homes upon the shifting marshes and tidal flats, where rivers kissed the North Sea and the wind never slept. These were the ancestors of the Frisians, quiet builders of worlds that could vanish overnight beneath the tide. To live here was to make peace with uncertainty. The ground beneath your feet could betray you. The sea could reclaim your fields, and yet the people stayed. Generation after generation, they shaped the land as the land shaped them, half farmers, half sailors, and entirely bound to the rhythm of the waves. The earliest Frisians were children of both migration and memory. Traces of their settlements appear like ghosts in the soil, wooden posts, fragments of pottery, animal bones from cattle and sheep raised on the edge of the sea. Roman historians, gazing northward across their empire, wrote of them with a mixture of awe and frustration. They were, the Romans said, stubborn people of the marshes, impossible to conquer because they could simply vanish into their watery homeland. The legions could not march where the tide ruled, and the Frisians knew every channel, every hidden path through the wetlands. For Rome, they were more nuisance than threat, but for the Frisians, this isolation was freedom. As the centuries turned, trade became their lifeline. The sea, once a barrier, became a bridge. They exchanged amber, hides, and salt for Roman goods, wine, glass, and fine cloth. Some Frisians even served in the Roman army, their courage earning quiet respect among soldiers who fought far from the marshes. Yet when the empire's shadow began to fade and its borders crumbled, the Frisians remained untouched, their small villages flickering in the twilight of a collapsing world. Where others saw the fall of Rome as an ending, the Frisians saw it as an opening, a chance for their waters to once again become the center of trade between the fading south and the awakening north. Archaeologists tell of Turpan, great artificial mounds of earth upon which the Frisians built their homes to survive the floods. From these heights, they could watch the storms sweep across the sea, knowing that beneath them, the tide surged and receded as it always had. Every terp was a testament to endurance, a quiet declaration that they would not yield. Even before they built dikes or canals, they understood that survival here required patience, unity, and faith in the rhythm of nature. And perhaps it was in this daily battle with the elements that their fierce independence was born. For how could any ruler claim dominion over people who had already mastered the forces of the sea itself? In those early centuries, before the Frisians were drawn into the web of empires and faith, they were defined by balance between land and water, community and solitude, defiance and adaptation. Their villages were small, but their world was vast, an unending horizon where the sun rose from the sea and sank back into it each day. To live as a Frisian was to understand that life could not be controlled, only navigated. And in that truth lay their strength. When the Romans left and the North Sea world entered the shadowed dawn of the Middle Ages, the Frisians did not vanish into history's silence. They endured quietly in their marshes and islands, waiting for the tides to turn again. The world beyond their shores might crumble and rebuild itself, but the sea would always return, and with it, the people who called it home. Because long before the Frisians were free, they were resilient. And that, perhaps, was the first kind of freedom the world ever knew. When the world was still finding its shape after Rome's fall, the Frisians had already begun to carve their own realm, not upon land, but upon water. Theirs was not an empire built of marble and conquest, but of wood, wind, and tide. From the quiet marshes of the north, they built sleek ships with shallow hulls that could glide over sandbanks and into narrow rivers where others dared not sail. These ships became their lifeblood, carrying goods, people, and stories from one corner of the North Sea to another. To the east lay the Saxons, to the south the Franks, to the west the distant Isles of Britain. But between them all, the Frisians moved freely, merchants and sailors in a world still waking from the darkness of the old empire. Their harbors were simple, yet full of life. Wooden piers jutted into the water, sails snapped in the wind, and traders shouted over the clamor of gulls. From the rivers of the Rhine to the coasts of Denmark, Frisian merchants became known for their skill, honesty, and daring. They carried furs from the north, wine and glass from the south, and salt, a treasure as vital as gold, from their own marshes. Some historians would later call this age the Frisian maritime century, a time when the North Sea became a living highway of exchange, and the Frisians were its tireless navigators. The cities that would later dominate medieval trade, Bruges, Lübeck, Hamburg, were still little more than fishing towns when the Frisians sailed their routes. They connected kingdoms that had no diplomats, languages that shared no words. Their ships were their flags, their reputation, their only shield. They were known to the Anglo-Saxons, who traded with them across the narrow sea, and to the Norse, who respected their seamanship even as they plundered their coasts. In a time when the world was fragmented and fearful, the Frisians were bridges between cultures. They were the quiet architects of early European trade, unsung but indispensable. But with prosperity came attention. Wealth never remains unnoticed for long. The Franks, led by ambitious kings, began to cast their gaze northward. They saw in the Frisian ports a prize, a gateway to the northern seas, and with it, control of the flow of goods and silver. Charlemagne himself, as his empire expanded, sought to draw the Frisians under his rule. At first, there was negotiation, trade for allegiance, protection for taxes. But freedom, for the Frisians, was not something to be traded. They had known no master but the sea, and they had little patience for kings who ruled from distant palaces. The conflict that followed was not a war of empires, but of principles. The Frisians resisted fiercely, retreating into their wetlands, striking from their ships, and fading again into the fog. For a time, their defiance seemed unstoppable. Even when the Franks claimed victory, it was a hollow one, because rule over Friesland was a claim that could never fully take root. The Frisians paid tribute when they had to, swore oaths when it suited them, but always kept one hand on the tiller, one eye on the horizon. Their story, during this age, was not one of conquest but of balance. They did not seek to dominate others, only to remain unbroken themselves. Every voyage they undertook was a statement of independence, every harbor a reminder that the world could be navigated without kings or crowns. And perhaps that is why, even in defeat, they never truly lost. Because the sea, restless, impartial, eternal, was on their side. The Frisians became symbols of what it meant to live freely in a world of rising empires. They were traders, not tyrants, sailors, not soldiers. And yet, through trade, they held a power that even emperors envied, the power to connect, to move, to endure. And so, beneath the endless gray skies of the North Sea, a quiet kingdom thrived. No borders marked it, no armies guarded it, yet it lived in every wave and every whisper of wind. It was a kingdom of tides, a kingdom called Friesland. As the waves of trade rolled across the North Sea, another tide began to rise, quieter, slower, but far more enduring. It came not with ships of merchants, but with men carrying crosses. The dawn of the 8th century saw the first missionaries arrive upon Frisian shores, their cloaks heavy with rain, their hearts heavy with purpose. They came from distant monasteries in Britain and Francia, following the call of faith and empire alike. To the Frisians, they were strangers speaking of a single God in a land that had always worshipped many, the spirits of the water, the sky, the earth, and the ancestors who slept beneath the dunes. Among the earliest of these wanderers was Saint Willibrord, the English missionary who landed in the town of Utrecht around 690. He found a people both curious and cautious. The Frisians were not hostile to new gods. They had traded too long and too far to fear foreign ideas, but they were not easily swayed. To them, faith was not something one adopted. It was woven into the seasons, the soil, and the sea. The gods they knew were practical and near, the wind that filled the sails, the waves that took or spared a ship, the fire that kept a hearth alive in the long northern winter. The notion of one invisible God, ruling all things, felt distant, abstract, foreign to a people whose lives were defined by survival and tide. Still, Willibrord persisted. He built small churches of wood near the coast, taught the word of his faith in simple speech, and baptized those willing to listen. His work was slow, but his patience deep. Yet just as the light began to spread, it was dimmed by war. The Franks, led by Charles Martel, struck north again, seeking to break Frisian independence once and for all. The missionaries followed in their wake, not just as men of God, but as tools of empire. To many Frisians, Christianity became a symbol not of peace, but of submission. When Radbod, the Frisian king, was offered baptism, he famously asked one question: "Will I find my ancestors in this new heaven you speak of?" The priest answered truthfully, "No, for they were not baptized." Radbod stepped back from the font and replied, "Then I would rather be in hell with my ancestors than in heaven without them." And with that, he turned away from conversion, choosing the faith of his forefathers over the promise of salvation. It is said that the wind howled through the church that night, and that the sea itself rose high, as if in defiance. Whether the tale is myth or memory hardly matters. The spirit behind it is pure Frisian. To them, loyalty to kin, to tradition, and to the land was as sacred as any prayer. Faith imposed by power was no faith at all. But time, like tide, wears down even the strongest shore. After Radbod's death, the Franks returned with greater force. Charlemagne himself wove Christianity into his conquest, baptizing entire regions by decree, building churches where temples once stood. The old gods faded into legend, their names whispered only by fishermen and farmers in the dark. Slowly, the cross rose over Friesland. Yet even in this conversion, something remained distinct. The Frisians adopted Christianity, but on their own terms. Their churches were small and humble. Ruling all things felt distant, abstract, foreign to a people whose lives were defined by survival and tide. Still, Willibrord persisted. He built small churches of wood near the coast, taught the word of his faith in simple speech, and baptized those willing to listen. His work was slow, but his patience deep. Yet just as the light began to spread, it was dimmed by war. The Franks, led by Charles Martel, struck north again, seeking to break Frisian independence once and for all. The missionaries followed in their wake, not just as men of God, but as tools of empire. To many Frisians, Christianity became a symbol not of peace, but of submission. When Radbod, the Frisian king, was offered baptism, he famously asked one question: "Will I find my ancestors in this new heaven you speak of?" The priest answered truthfully, "No, for they were not baptized." Radbod stepped back from the font and replied, "Then I would rather be in hell with my ancestors than in heaven without them." And with that, he turned away from conversion, choosing the faith of his forefathers over the promise of salvation. It is said that the wind howled through the church that night, and that the sea itself rose high, as if in defiance. Whether the tale is myth or memory hardly matters. The spirit behind it is pure Frisian. To them, loyalty to kin, to tradition, and to the land was as sacred as any prayer. Faith imposed by power was no faith at all. But time, like tide, wears down even the strongest shore. After Radbod's death, the Franks returned with greater force. Charlemagne himself wove Christianity into his conquest, baptizing entire regions by decree, building churches where temples once stood. The old gods faded into legend, their names whispered only by fishermen and farmers in the dark. Slowly, the cross rose over Friesland. Yet even in this conversion, something remained distinct. The Frisians adopted Christianity, but on their own terms. Their churches were small and humble. Their faith rooted not in pomp, but in perseverance. They prayed, yes, but they still watched the tides and the skies, still built their turpen, still believed in fate as much as in grace. In the end, their Christianity was like their land, hard-won, practical, and enduring. The sea had taught them that nothing is absolute, that all things move in cycles. And so they embraced the new faith not as conquerors demanded, but as survivors do, with quiet strength and unshaken identity. For though the Frisians bent beneath the weight of empire and the cross, they never broke. When the banners of Charlemagne reached the northern seas, they brought not just soldiers, but the weight of a new order. To the Frisians, the empire was like a tide, inevitable, patient, and powerful. The Franks came with their priests, their law, and their language. They built churches beside old shrines, fortresses beside harbors, and markets where the Frisians once gathered freely to trade. For a time, it seemed that the world was changing too quickly to resist. But even under the shadow of the great emperor, the Frisians never truly bowed. They learned to bend, to survive, to wait. For no empire lasts forever, and no tide rises without falling. Charlemagne's rule was both harsh and calculated. He understood that control over the North Sea meant control over Europe's arteries of trade. To tame the Frisians was to open the way to Denmark, to Scandinavia, to the lands of the Norse. Yet he also understood that the Frisians were unlike the other peoples he had conquered. They were not a mountain tribe, nor a landlocked kingdom. They lived in a world of water and wind, a world that no army could truly master. So he ruled them through compromise. Local chieftains were granted privileges, free men retained certain rights, and taxes were collected more by negotiation than decree. It was an uneasy peace, the empire's crown resting lightly upon the sea-borne shoulders of a restless people. In this period, something remarkable happened. Despite their loss of political independence, the Frisians found new ways to endure. They became indispensable to the empire, shipbuilders, traders, and navigators who connected the Frankish heartland with the distant edges of the realm. Frisian merchants carried salt and wool to Flanders, iron to the Rhine, and fish to the imperial courts. They sailed not only for themselves, but for the very emperor who had subdued them. Yet even as they served, they remained apart. They kept their laws, their councils, their quiet assemblies where disputes were settled not by royal edict, but by the consent of free men. In the heart of this fragile balance stood Frisian freedom, a concept that would echo through centuries. It was not a charter written in gold or sealed by kings. It was an understanding, ancient and instinctive, that no man ruled another by divine right, that justice belonged to the people themselves. As long as they could meet in assembly, speak their minds, and defend their land together, they were free, no matter whose banner flew above them. This belief was their inheritance from the ancestors, and even Charlemagne, with all his power, could not erase it. But peace is never eternal. After Charlemagne's death in 814, the empire began to fracture, and the North Sea grew dangerous once more. New powers stirred in the mist: the Norsemen, the Viking raiders whose longships cut through the waves like blades. They struck without warning, their sails black against the dawn, their axes gleaming with salt and steel. The Frisians, for all their seamanship, could not always stand against them. Villages burned, monasteries were sacked, and trade faltered. Yet the Frisians were not helpless. They fought back from their ships, defended their harbors, and learned from their enemies, adopting faster ships, stronger defenses, and a hardened will. The sea had always been both the cradle and the curse of the Frisians. It gave them life, trade, and the rhythm of their days, and now it brought their greatest trial. In the 9th century, dark sails appeared on the horizon. Longships, sleek and hungry, carved through the waves like blades drawn from a sheath. They came first as whispers, then as storms, the Vikings of the north, who turned the peaceful coastlines of Frisia into battlegrounds of fire and fear. At dawn, when the mist still clung to the marshes and the gulls cried over the tides, the first raids began. Wooden palisades fell, churches burned, and monasteries that had stood as sanctuaries became pyres against the morning sky. The Frisians had seen war before. They had faced the Franks, the Saxons, the Danes, but never enemies like these. The Vikings were not armies bound by borders or kings. They were waves of chaos, moving with the rhythm of the sea, striking swiftly, vanishing before the cry for help could reach inland. And yet, even as villages burned, the spirit of the Frisians did not. They were a people born of storms, raised on shifting sands and tides that cared nothing for empires. When the longships came, they learned to watch the horizon differently, not with fear, but with readiness. Coastal watchtowers rose along the dikes. Bells were hung in wooden frames to sound the alarm, and shipwrights began to build vessels faster and leaner, mirroring the design of their foes. The Frisians adapted, as they always had. Trade faltered, yes, but never died. Even in the worst of times, Frisian merchants sailed into the teeth of danger, carrying salt, wool, and amber along the same routes their ancestors had charted. Some even traded with the very men who had once raided them, forging uneasy truces in harbors where gold and steel spoke louder than oaths. It was said that in Dorstad, the great Frisian trade city, Norsemen and Frisians drank from the same cups, enemies by sea, partners by profit. For both peoples were children of the north, and both understood that the sea demanded no loyalty, but survival. Still, the raids left deep scars. Many of the grand churches built under the Franks were left in ruins, their relics stolen or buried to keep them safe. Entire families vanished, taken as slaves to the markets of Hedeby or Dublin. Yet from the ashes of destruction came renewal. The Frisians, more than any other coastal people, learned to fortify their homes, to turn marshes into moats, and to unite when the tides of war rose high. There were heroes, too, men whose names were sung in low tones across the dikes and markets. Folkmar the Brave, who led his men from a sinking ship to retake a burning village. Heo of the Marshes, who ambushed a fleet of Norse raiders using the tides themselves as a trap, and the nameless women who hid their children beneath the floorboards as fire consumed their world above. Their courage was quiet, their victories fleeting, but they mattered. Because every night that a village survived, every ship that returned home with its crew alive, was a defiance of fate itself. By the end of the Viking Age, Frisia was battered but unbroken. The raiders came and went, as all storms do. The monasteries were rebuilt, the trade routes reopened, and the harbors filled once more with the creak of masts and the call of merchants. The Frisians had endured, not because they were stronger, but because they were rooted in something deeper than conquest, a unity born not from empire, but from survival. When the last of the Viking sails faded into legend, Frisia stood scarred yet proud, its people seasoned by hardship and its spirit unyielding. The empire of Charlemagne was gone. The Norse kingdoms had found peace, but the Frisians remained, watchful, free, and quietly defiant, just as the tides had taught them to be. When the fires of the Viking Age finally dimmed and the winds of war fell still, the Frisians stood at a crossroads between ruin and renewal. Many lands had broken under centuries of invasion, but not Frisia. Out of the ashes, a new order began to take shape, not forged by kings or noble lords, but by the will of the people themselves. It was a rare miracle in a world ruled by crowns and chains. While neighboring realms bent beneath the weight of feudal law, the Frisians remembered something older, something sacred, their freedom. They called it Friesisch Freiheit, the Frisian freedom. It was not written by monarchs or enforced by knights, but carried in the voices of farmers, traders, and elders who gathered in open-air assemblies beneath the wide northern sky. Here, in the windswept plains and marshy meadows, justice was not dictated from a throne but debated among equals. Every freeman could speak, every dispute could be heard, and every decision was bound by the ancient principle: God created all men free. From these gatherings emerged the Uppstalsboom, a great council where representatives from across the Frisian lands met once a year near Auric. Beneath an old oak tree, banners of every Frisian district fluttered together in the breeze, a living symbol of unity. There, they renewed their oaths to defend one another, to uphold the law, and to resist any ruler who would claim dominion over them. The sound of their vows carried across the fields, as solemn and steady as the beating of the sea. Their laws were complex, yet deeply human, shaped not by ambition, but by experience. The Lex Frisianum, a code rooted in centuries of tradition, laid out fines and penalties not to crush men, but to keep peace between them. Lived under the rule of others, but in the quiet corners of the coast, they still whispered the stories of the time before kings. And in those whispers, the old vow still echoed, as steady and eternal as the tides. We are Frisians, free as the wind, bound to no master but the sea. The story of the Frisians did not end with conquest. Empires came and went, maps were redrawn, and kings traded lands like coins, but the sea remembered. It remembered the hands that built the first dikes, the voices that sang to the storm, and the people who refused to bow. Though their freedom was taken, their spirit lived on, hidden in the rhythm of their work, in the quiet faith of their villages, and in the stubborn pride that marked every Frisian heart. By the dawn of the modern age, Friesland had become a province within larger powers, first Saxon, then Habsburg, and later Dutch. Yet even as foreign flags fluttered above their towns, the Frisians remained what they had always been: distinct, enduring, unshaken. They spoke their own language, soft and melodic, older than Dutch, rooted in the same earth that had once borne their freedom. In their homes, they told stories not of kings or saints, but of farmers who defied the floods, sailors who vanished into the fog, and mothers who kept the lamps burning when the sea rose too high. Every field, every canal, every mound of earth in Friesland was shaped by centuries of survival. The land was not merely inhabited, it was made. Where once the sea had ruled, the Frisians had reclaimed it, inch by inch, dike by dike. The salt marshes were turned into farmland, the wetlands into villages. It was a miracle of patience and perseverance, a quiet defiance that continued long after swords were laid down. They no longer fought empires. They fought the tide, the storms, and the slow passage of time. And in doing so, they preserved their identity more completely than any conqueror could ever understand. Theft, injury, and murder were measured not only by crime, but by consequence, with balance and compensation favored over blind vengeance. Even women, rare in medieval law, had rights of inheritance and protection under Frisian custom, a testament to the fairness their society sought, even in harsh times. But freedom was a fragile thing. It drew envy, suspicion, and eventually, the attention of those who sought to rule what they could not understand. From the south came the princes of Saxony and the bishops of Utrecht, claiming divine authority over Frisian soil. Yet the Frisians answered not with rebellion, but with resilience. They did not need castles to defend their land. Their defense was the land itself, the labyrinth of dikes, tidal flats, and marshes that no foreign army could easily cross. Every man was both farmer and soldier. Every village was both home and fortress. When the tide rose, the Frisians moved their battles to higher ground. When enemies marched, they flooded the fields and watched them sink. No invader could hold what the sea refused to give. And so the Frisians became a paradox, humble in their daily lives, but unbreakable when threatened. Across the centuries, poets and priests from distant lands would write of them with a mix of admiration and disbelief, a people without kings, without castles, yet somehow still free. Their independence became legend, their stubbornness myth. The phrase, "the free Frisians bow to none but God," echoed across the medieval world, not a boast, but a truth carried in every heart. Even as the world beyond their shores shifted, empires rose and fell, crusades marched east, cities burned, the Frisians held to their way. Theirs was not a freedom of conquest, but of conscience, not the fire of war, but the quiet endurance of the tide. It was the freedom to live by one's own word, to gather beneath the open sky, and to be ruled by nothing but law and the rhythm of the sea. By the 12th century, the roar of war had faded into the rhythm of hammers and waves. The North Sea, once a theater of raids and conquest, had become a vast highway of trade, and the Frisians were its quiet masters. From their windswept harbors and muddy inlets, ships began to rise again. Low, wide-bellied cogs built to endure the tempests of the northern waters. The sails were patched, the timbers dark with salt, and on their decks, the heart of Frisian life beat once more. They sailed not for glory, but for gain, carrying wool from England, salt from the marshes, grain from the flatlands, and fish from the cold northern shoals. Their routes stretched far, from the harbors of London to the fjords of Norway, from the Danish Isles to the busy quays of Lübeck and Hamburg. They traded with anyone who had something to offer, guided by the belief that the sea belonged to all who dared to cross it. The ports of Frisia became hives of movement and sound. In Dockum, Harlingen, and Stavern, the cries of merchants filled the air. The smell of tar and fish mingled with the sweetness of honey and mead. Ships unloaded barrels of herring beside baskets of amber, bolts of wool beside sacks of salt. And everywhere, the Frisian tongue, a soft blend of Germanic roots and coastal rhythm, could be heard haggling, laughing, singing. Unlike the great merchant guilds of the South, the Frisians did not rely on kings or monopolies to protect them. Their strength lay in their community, a network of families bound by trust, reputation, and shared danger. Every voyage was a gamble, every cargo a promise. They sailed through storms, pirates, and shifting sands with little more than faith and skill. It was said that a Frisian shipmaster could read the sea like a book, knowing by its scent when a storm was near, or by the curl of a wave when the depth began to change. As trade flourished, the Frisians became known throughout the Hanseatic world. Though they were never formal members of the Hanseatic League, they were essential to its lifeblood. Their ships carried goods between the great ports, their sailors manned foreign fleets, and their merchants often served as mediators between rival cities. They were the quiet intermediaries of the North, trusted, respected, sometimes envied, but always indispensable. Wealth began to flow inland. Simple wooden homes gave way to brick houses with tall gables and narrow windows. Churches rose higher, their spires piercing the fog. Markets grew busier, and coins bearing foreign kings' faces found their way into Frisian hands. Yet even in prosperity, they remained grounded. They wore their wealth lightly, their pride resting not in gold, but in their freedom to earn it. Still, the tides of trade were never steady. The same sea that carried fortune could also carry ruin. When storms struck, entire fleets could vanish overnight, swallowed by the gray abyss. In the winter of 1219, the St. Marcellus flood tore through the Frisian coast, drowning thousands and swallowing villages whole. But even then, when the land was broken and the fields turned to salt, the Frisians rebuilt. They always did. Their resilience became a kind of legend among seafarers. Foreign captains spoke of the Frisian way, a calm resolve in the face of disaster, a refusal to curse the sea that fed them. They understood, as their ancestors had, that the North Sea was not an enemy to be conquered, but a force to be respected. And in that respect lay their survival. By the dawn of the 13th century, Frisia was no longer a forgotten corner of Europe. It was a crossroads between England and Germany, between the old pagan north and the Christian south. The Frisians had turned hardship into heritage and wind into wealth. And while the empires around them built their strength on conquest and crowns, the Frisians built theirs on tide and trade, quiet, persistent, and free. Faith came to Frisia not on the tip of a sword, but on the tide. It drifted ashore with weary missionaries and patient monks, men who saw in this wild northern land both a challenge and a calling. Long before cathedrals rose in stone, wooden crosses stood among the reeds, and the wind that carried the scent of salt and peat also carried the sound of distant bells. Christianity had come, slowly, quietly, like a seed carried by the wind, and here it took root in marsh and mud. The story of Frisian faith began centuries earlier with Saint Willibrord, an English monk who crossed the sea in the 7th century, braving the uncertain tides to bring the gospel to these untamed shores. He built his church at Utrecht and preached among the fishermen and farmers, learning their tongue, earning their trust. Where other missionaries demanded obedience, Willibrord offered understanding. The Frisians, practical as ever, did not abandon their old gods easily, but they listened. They weighed faith as they weighed all things, by its usefulness, its endurance. And in time, many found that the Christian God was not unlike the sea, unseen, powerful, unpredictable, and always present. By the 12th century, monasteries dotted the landscape, small islands of order amid a restless land. They were not fortresses, but sanctuaries, built of stone and timber upon the high grounds the monks themselves raised by hand. The Benedictines and Cistercians came, bringing not only faith but knowledge, draining swamps, taming rivers, teaching new ways to till and tend the soil. To live in Frisia was to live against the elements, and the monks became masters of that delicate balance. Their prayers rose with the morning mist. Their labor echoed in the sound of shovels shaping dikes and canals. These monastic communities became the heartbeat of the Frisian countryside. They offered refuge to travelers, bread to the hungry, and wisdom to those who sought it. The monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving the wisdom of Rome and the scriptures of Jerusalem, while outside their walls, the wind howled and the sea clawed at the land. In time, their quiet discipline became part of the Frisian spirit, a merging of faith and endurance, of human will against the eternal tide. But faith in Frisia was never blind. It was not a faith of fear, but of acceptance, an understanding that the sea would rise, that storms would come, and that life would continue nonetheless. Churches were built upon mounds, their foundations raised against floods, their walls thick enough to withstand centuries of wind. Inside, fishermen prayed for calm seas, farmers for dry fields, mothers for safe returns. Outside, the graves of generations lay beneath the grass, marked by simple stones, each one a testament to survival. Even the landscape seemed to preach resilience. The endless horizon, where sky met water in a pale shimmer, reminded every soul that man was small, but not powerless. To the Frisians, faith was not about dominion over nature, but coexistence with it. Their prayers were practical, their hymns humble. They did not ask for miracles, only for strength to rebuild when the waters came again. Over time, the monasteries grew wealthy from the land they tamed and the salt they traded, but they never forgot their origins. Their abbots were engineers as much as priests. Their faith was measured in dikes, mills, and drained fields. And though the world around them changed, kingdoms rose and borders shifted, The monks of Frisia remained as steady as the stones of their cloisters. In this union of earth and spirit, of toil and trust, the Frisians found something profound, a faith that reflected their world, patient, enduring, shaped by wind and wave. For them, salvation was not found in distant heavens, but in the act of holding their ground, of keeping their land alive for those who would come after. And so, as the sea whispered beyond the dikes and the bells tolled across the fields, faith in Frisia became not a religion of conquest, but of coexistence, the quiet conviction that even in a world ruled by uncertainty, one could still find peace in the rhythm of the tide. For a time, peace held across the flat lands of Frisia. The tides came and went. The monks worked the soil, and merchants filled the harbors with the sounds of prosperity. But peace in medieval Europe was never permanent. It was a pause between claims. Beyond the dikes and dunes, greater powers stirred. Princes, counts, and bishops, all hungering for land and tithe, turned their gaze toward the free lands of the Frisians. To them, Frisia was an anomaly, a land without lords, without castles, without a king. And to a feudal world built on hierarchy and control, such freedom was not a wonder, it was an offense. From the south came the counts of Holland, ambitious and relentless. They claimed the coastal lowlands as their birthright, arguing that Frisia had once been part of their realm before time and tide had washed away those borders. From the east came the bishops of Utrecht, wielding not swords but parchment, armed with papal bulls that declared spiritual authority over the northern lands. And from the west, across the gray waters, even the Danish kings occasionally cast covetous eyes toward the Frisian coast. The Frisians had no standing army, no grand fortifications to deter invasion, but they had what their ancestors had always relied on: the land, the tides, and each other. When Holland's armies tried to march north, they found themselves knee-deep in flooded meadows and treacherous bogs, where the sea could turn friend to foe in the span of a tide. When bishops sent their clerics demanding tithes and submission, they found stubborn silence and the quiet refusal of a people who bowed only to God. Yet these pressures were not without consequence. The once united Frisian territories began to feel the strain of outside influence. Some chieftains, tempted by wealth or safety, began to align with foreign powers, while others clung fiercely to the old freedom. Frisia, once bound by the common oath of the Upstilsboom, began to fracture. Local families, the Herrings, the Commingas, the Annas, rose as regional leaders, their influence growing as the external threats multiplied. What had begun as unity through freedom slowly transformed into a fragile balance of rivalries. The bishops, clever as they were pious, understood that force alone could not tame the Frisians. They turned instead to faith as their weapon. Churches multiplied, tithes increased, and priests began to speak not only of salvation but of obedience. Some Frisians accepted this quietly, their faith sincere but cautious. Others resisted, arguing that no man should pay for the privilege of praying to God. In the marshland villages, whispers of defiance spread, of sermons spoken in secret, of assemblies that met without church sanction. The old independence, the spirit of the tide, began to stir again. But the world was changing. Across Europe, kings were growing stronger, cities richer, and the church more powerful than ever. The Hanseatic League now ruled the northern trade, and even the Frisians, for all their skill and seafaring pride, could not ignore its reach. For the first time in generations, their freedom began to feel fragile, not because of invasion, but because of isolation. The powers around them were building walls of law and commerce, and the sea that had once been their highway now carried not just opportunity, but threat. Still, the Frisians did what they had always done: they adapted. When armies came, they vanished into the mist. When the church pressed, they debated. When the sea broke their dikes, they rebuilt. Every storm, every flood, every raid became another chapter in their long defiance. Their motto endured, whispered in taverns, carved above church doors, and carried on the lips of sailors bound for England: Illa Frias Freedom. the free Frisians bow to none but God. And though the shadows of counts and bishops grew longer, their light never truly reached the heart of Frisia. The fields still belonged to those who tilled them, the ships to those who sailed them, and the land itself to those who refused to let it go. The freedom of the Frisians had survived emperors, storms, and centuries, but it would not survive themselves. As the 13th century waned, the bond that had held the land together, the sacred unity of the Upstalsboom, began to fray. The Frisians, once a single people bound by law and shared struggle, became a patchwork of rival districts and proud families. Without kings or counts to rule them, power flowed to those who could command men and defend dikes, the hoofdelingen, or chieftains. At first, these chieftains were guardians, protectors of their local communities. They led militias against raiders, mediated disputes, and upheld the ancient laws. But as wealth from trade poured in and foreign threats multiplied, ambition crept into their hearts. The authority once shared in open assemblies became concentrated in manor houses of brick and stone. Small fortresses, stins, began to rise across the countryside, their towers casting long shadows over the flat fields. Each family flew its own banner, each chieftain his own pride. Feuds erupted like sparks on dry grass. A quarrel over a boundary ditch could grow into a blood feud spanning generations. A slight at a market could lead to raids between villages. The old idea of collective freedom, of one people standing together against the world, began to dissolve into a landscape of suspicion and vengeance. Frisia had no king, but now it had too many lords. The land split into factions, shearingers and vetkopers, names born from old grievances that grew into movements. The shearingers, often aligned with the monasteries and rural farmers, saw themselves as defenders of the old faith and traditional law. The vetkopers, wealthier and more urban, represented the new merchant class, pragmatic, ambitious, and willing to ally with foreign powers for profit. What began as local disputes turned into civil war. Smoke rose above the meadows where once only windmills turned. Brothers took up arms against brothers, and entire villages were drawn into cycles of revenge. The assembly halls stood empty, their laws ignored. The oaths sworn beneath the oak of the Upstalsboom became distant memory. Where unity had once been their strength, pride became their undoing. Foreign powers watched with quiet satisfaction. The counts of Holland, long thwarted in their attempts to subdue the Frisians, saw opportunity in their division. The bishops of Utrecht whispered blessings to those chieftains willing to bend the knee. Even the Hanseatic merchants began to take sides, funding whichever faction offered better access to trade routes. Slowly, the independence that had survived centuries of conquest began to crumble, not under invasion, but under the weight of its own chaos. And yet, even in the midst of blood and betrayal, there were glimmers of the old spirit. When floods struck, rival factions called temporary truces to rebuild the dikes together. When the sea broke through the land, it did not care for politics. And in those desperate hours, Frisians remembered that they were still one people, bound by a shared enemy older than any feud. But such moments were brief, swallowed again by the noise of war and pride. Across the marshes, the once peaceful towers of the chieftains burned in the night. Songs were written of heroes and traitors, of lost unity and endless rain. And in the silence that followed each battle, the wind carried a question, one that no one dared to answer aloud. Had the freedom they fought to preserve become the very thing that destroyed them? By the dawn of the 15th century, Frisia was no longer a land of equals, but of factions. The old dream of a free, united people had faded into the mist. Yet deep beneath the ashes of war, the embers still glowed, that quiet, stubborn spirit that refused to die, waiting for the day when the tide would turn once more. By the 15th century, the once proud land of the Frisians stood at a crossroads. The endless wars between shearingers and vetkopers had drained their strength, leaving towns ruined and villages divided. The dikes, their lifelines, crumbled in neglect. Trade faltered, and the laughter of markets gave way to the clatter of swords. The very freedom the Frisians had guarded for centuries now weighed upon them like an anchor, for in their refusal to accept a single ruler, they had become easy prey for those who did. To the west, the rising power of Holland, a county once overshadowed by its neighbors, began to look toward the north with ambition. The Dutch, driven by trade, wealth, and a growing sense of unity, saw the Frisian lands not only as fertile ground, but as a key to controlling the northern seas. The age of chieftains was ending, the age of states was beginning. And so, like a tide creeping over sand, Dutch influence began to seep into Frisia, first through merchants, then through soldiers, and finally through law. It began subtly. Dutch traders offered fairer prices, safer routes, and coin minted in cities that gleamed with prosperity. Weary from war, Frisian towns welcomed the stability. In markets once ruled by barter and oath, now flowed silver stamped with foreign emblems. Dutch builders repaired the dikes and harbors, and their presence brought order, but it came with a price. Behind every contract was a condition, behind every alliance, a quiet expectation, loyalty. When diplomacy failed, force followed. The armies of Holland marched north under banners that fluttered like new dawns, claiming to bring peace. Some chieftains surrendered willingly, hoping to preserve their estates. Others resisted, rallying their people for one last stand beneath the cry, freedom or death. The clashes were fierce, but brief. The Frisians fought with the courage of their ancestors, yet courage alone could not hold back the disciplined ranks of a unified state. Their enemies did not seek to destroy them, only to tame them. One by one, the strongholds of the chieftains fell. The stins that had once symbolized defiance now burned in surrender. In 1498, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, weary of Frisian unrest, granted the land to his ally, Duke Albrecht of Saxony, to restore order. To the Frisians, it was a bitter betrayal, their fabled freedom bartered away by distant hands. Yet resistance still flickered in the marshes and the islands. Men like Peer Gerlof's Donia, known to legend as Grut Peer, rose to lead rebel bands against the foreign rulers, their cries echoing across the flatlands. Peer's strength and fury became the stuff of myth. His sword was said to be taller than a man, his voice able to silence crowds. For a moment, it seemed as if the spirit of old Frisia had returned. But no legend could turn back time. Grut Peer's rebellion burned bright, then faded, leaving behind only songs and stories. The old assemblies dissolved, replaced by governors and officials. Sent from the south, Frisian law, though respected in name, bent to foreign rule. Yet, even in submission, the Frisians did not lose themselves entirely. They adapted, as they always had, shaping their identity not through conquest, but through endurance. They learned to survive in a world that no longer understood freedom as they had once lived it. By the dawn of the 16th century, Frisia was no longer a sovereign land of free farmers and seafarers. It was part of a greater whole, first under Saxony, then under the Habsburgs, and eventually the Dutch Republic. But within every village, in the language spoken by fishermen, in the songs sung by mothers to their children, the old spirit lingered. It was quieter now, but it endured, like a whisper carried over the waves, a promise that though kingdoms rise and fall, freedom, once lived, is never entirely lost. Long after their banners had fallen and their assemblies had faded into memory, the Frisians remained, not as a forgotten people, but as a quiet pulse along the edge of the sea. Their land was no longer independent, their leaders no longer chosen by the voice of the people, but something deeper survived, the soul of a nation shaped by water and wind. The North Sea, that great restless force, had always been their truest companion. It had taken as much as it had given, flooding their fields, stealing their sons, but also providing life, trade, and connection. To live as a Frisian was to live in balance with the sea, to respect its moods, and to understand that freedom could exist even in surrender, so long as one's spirit remained unbroken. The centuries turned, and new powers rose: Spain, the Dutch Republic, the British Empire. each leaving their mark upon the coastline where the Frisians had once ruled themselves. Yet the people adapted, as they always had. They built new dikes, forged new harbors, and turned their hands once again to the sea. Fishermen carried the old tongue on the wind, their songs drifting across the waves like prayers. Traders still spoke of the honesty of Frisian merchants, the reliability of their word. And though Latin and Dutch ruled the written page, the Frisian language endured in the mouths of the common people, soft, rhythmic, and ancient, like the sea itself. It became one of Europe's oldest surviving tongues, a living echo of a time when their freedom was law and their word was oath. In the villages that clung to the edges of Friesland, old customs persisted. On cold nights, elders told stories of Grut Pier, of the days when free men met beneath open skies, when no foreign lord could claim their land. They spoke of courage not as conquest, but as endurance, the courage to hold on when the world changes around you, the courage to bend without breaking. Children listened, wide-eyed, as the past came alive in the flicker of firelight. And though they lived under foreign crowns, they grew up knowing who they were. The Frisians became farmers, sailors, scholars, and traders once more. Their ports hummed with life, their ships crossed oceans, and their people traveled far, to England, America, and beyond, carrying with them the quiet strength of their ancestors. Wherever they went, they built, they worked, and they endured. And even those who left never truly escaped the pull of the North Sea. In letters and journals, in the fading ink of history, they wrote of it, the sound of the wind across the marshes, the cries of gulls, the feeling of home that no city could replace. By the time the modern world dawned, with its factories, empires, and borders drawn by men who never saw the sea, the Frisians had become part of the great European tapestry. Yet within that weave, their thread remained distinct. They were never loud, never conquering, but always steadfast. Their contribution was subtle yet immense, a legacy of self-rule, of community law, of resistance to tyranny. In many ways, the democratic ideals that later shaped Europe, the idea that ordinary people could govern themselves, were rooted in that ancient concept of Frisian freedom. Today, the name Frisia still lingers on maps, and the Frisian flag still flutters, white and blue, marked by red lily leaves that look like hearts. The language is still spoken, taught, and cherished. It survives in poems, songs, and voices carried by the wind over the same sea their ancestors once sailed. The spirit of the Frisians was never extinguished. It simply transformed, flowing with time like the tide that shaped their land. For in the end, freedom is not about dominion or empire. It is about the quiet strength to remain yourself, even when the world forgets your name. So when the waves crash against the shores of the Netherlands, when the mist rolls over the lowlands and the gulls circle above, listen closely, and perhaps, if the wind is right, you'll hear them still. The whispers of the Frisians, the people of the sea, who once stood free beneath the endless northern sky. Centuries have passed since the last free Frisian assembly met beneath an open sky. The marshes have been drained, the wild rivers tamed, and the coastline reshaped by human hands. The once scattered villages have grown into towns, their harbors now filled with modern ships of steel instead of wood and sail. Yet beneath the hum of engines and the distant sound of seagulls, there lingers something older, something unmistakably Frisian. It's not in the crowns or titles, not in the monuments of empire, but in the quiet resilience of the people who still call this narrow edge of the sea their home. Modern Friesland, Friesland, as they name it in their own tongue, stretches across the northern Netherlands, where green fields meet endless skies and windmills stand where fortresses once rose. To the east, East Frisia lies within Germany, its landscapes dotted with ancient churches, its people bound by centuries of shared memory. The borders drawn by kings and emperors have long divided the land, but the soul of the Frisians has never obeyed such lines. Across nations, they remain connected by language, by history, and by that same instinct to endure whatever the world sends their way. In the modern Netherlands, The Frisian identity is not a relic of the past. It breathes in daily life. The Frisian language, once spoken in whispers of defiance, is now celebrated openly. Schools teach it, writers craft poetry in it, and musicians sing it in soft, melodic tones that carry across canals and meadows. Road signs bear bilingual names, Dutch and Frisian, as if the land itself insists on remembering. The province's flag, white and blue with red lily hearts, flutters proudly from boats and homes, a symbol of a people who once swore never to bow to any foreign lord. Yet the echo of their ancient freedom still stirs quietly beneath the surface of modernity. It's in their politics, shaped by cooperation, by debate, by the belief that decisions should come from the people, not from above. It's in their communities, where neighbors still meet to solve problems together, echoing the Upstalsboom gatherings of old. Even in their humor, their blunt honesty, and their measured calm, there remains that same old streak of independence, the unspoken conviction that no matter how the world changes, the Frisians will remain who they are. Travelers who visit Friesland today often remark on the silence, a deep, vast stillness that stretches over the flat lands and windswept dikes. But it's not an emptiness. It's the sound of history at rest. The same wind that once filled Viking sails now turns wind turbines, generating power instead of propelling ships. The same waters that once flooded villages now shimmer peacefully in canals lined with flowers. Change, in this place, has never meant erasure. It has meant adaptation. Just as their ancestors reclaimed the land from the sea, modern Frisians reclaim their heritage from time. And though the world around them grows ever faster, with technology, globalization, and cities that never sleep, the Frisians still understand something essential, that life, like the tide, must flow and retreat, that even progress must respect the rhythm of nature. In this way, they remain as they always were, pragmatic dreamers, builders of both land and legacy, forever listening to the whispers of the sea that shaped them. Because the Frisians were never truly conquered, not by the Franks, nor by the Saxons, nor by the Dutch. Their borders changed, their rulers came and went, but their spirit endured. It hides not in rebellion now, but in the quiet pride of a people who carry their past lightly, not as a burden, but as a compass. And when the sea breeze sweeps across the lowlands at dusk, carrying the scent of salt and grass, one could almost imagine that somewhere, far off beyond the dunes, the old songs of freedom still rise with the wind. When night falls over the northern coast, and the horizon disappears into mist, there is a quiet that feels almost sacred. The wind hums softly across the dunes, the tide rolls in and out like a slow heartbeat, and the people who live here, farmers, sailors, students, children, walk beneath the same moon that once guided their ancestors home. They might not think of it often, but deep down, they carry something older than memory, a rhythm, a pulse, a way of being shaped by centuries of living between land and sea. It is not written in books or laws. It is written in the blood. The Frisians have always been children of the sea. It gave them everything, food, trade, the path to the wider world, and it threatened to take it all away. The sea was both mother and enemy, an unpredictable god that demanded respect. Generations of Frisians learned to listen to its moods, the color of the water, the scent of the wind, the low, distant rumble that meant a storm was coming. They built their lives around this rhythm, not in defiance of nature, but in harmony with it. That instinct, to endure without conquering, to live without claiming dominion, still lingers in their hearts, carried quietly through time. There are stories told in these coastal lands, of fishermen who could read the waves as others read words, of families who stayed through floods and rebuilt their homes again and again, of ghosts seen walking the dikes on misty mornings. The older generation says these aren't just tales, they're reminders. The sea, they whisper, remembers everyone it has ever touched. Every storm, every shipwreck, every drowned village. All of it still moves beneath the surface, like thoughts beneath the calm of sleep. To be Frisian is to feel that connection, To know that the past never really goes away, it just changes shape. In modern times, when satellites map every coastline and machines measure every tide, it's easy to forget that people once built their worlds on intuition and courage. Yet in Friesland, traces of that old bond remain. Farmers still check the wind before they check the weather forecast. Sailors still trust their instincts before their instruments. And when the storms come, as they still do, whole communities gather to reinforce dikes, shoulder to shoulder, as their ancestors did for 1,000 years. It's not just tradition. It's inheritance, the living memory of survival. Even the language, soft and melodic, carries the echo of the sea. The words for love, loss, and longing sound almost like waves themselves, fluid, wistful, unfinished. To outsiders, it seems strange, ancient. But to those who grew up hearing it, it feels like home, a link to every generation that came before. Some scholars say that language is history's most faithful witness. And if that's true, then the Frisian tongue is proof that history can whisper long after empires fall silent. And perhaps that's what makes the Frisians so quietly extraordinary. Their story is not one of conquest or empire, but of endurance, of learning to live with the elements, not above them. Their freedom was never about defying rulers alone. It was about defying the sea, the floods, and time itself. They built their lives where most would have fled, and they stayed, because this was home, the flat land where sky and water meet, where every sunrise feels like a promise, and every sunset like a memory. So when the wind picks up across the marshes and the gulls cry out over the waves, it's not just the sound of the sea, it's the sound of the past breathing softly through the present. The blood of the Frisians still hums with that eternal rhythm, as if every heartbeat remembers what it means to live between earth and water. And those centuries have changed their world. They remain the same at their core, steady. Long before borders divided the North, before the names England, Denmark, Germany, or Holland had meaning, there was only the sea, vast, cold, and full of possibility. The North Sea, gray and endless, was the highway of the early world. Across it, ships carved slow arcs of connection between distant shores. And upon those restless waters, the Frisians were not alone. They were part of a brotherhood of seafarers, the Norse, the Danes, the Saxons, and the Angles, all bound not by empire, but by survival, trade, and trust in the wind. The Frisians were traders long before they were warriors. Their ships, sleek, strong, and wide-bellied, carried goods between the great rivers of the continent and the far isles of Britain. In the markets of York, London, and Ribe, you could hear the sound of their language, soft yet firm, trading words with Saxon merchants and Norse sailors. Amber, salt, wool, iron, the currency of the early medieval world, passed through their hands. But what they carried was more than cargo. It was culture. Wherever the Frisians went, they left behind fragments of themselves, their tongue, their laws, their way of life. Even the English language bears their trace, subtle yet enduring, woven into words that still roll easily off modern tongues. They were known across the northern world not just as merchants, but as mediators, honest brokers who could be trusted to deal fairly in a world of shifting loyalties. When other peoples warred, the Frisians traded. When others raided, they sailed to negotiate peace. Yet, make no mistake, the sea had hardened them. They were not gentle dreamers. They were pragmatic survivors. They knew the cost of storms, of shipwrecks, of hunger on long voyages. Their strength was quiet, measured, and steady, like the sea on a calm day that could, in a heartbeat, turn to fury. The connection between these northern peoples was deep and instinctive. They shared gods once: Odin, Thor, Freya, names whispered in longhouses as the fire cracked and the wind howled outside. They shared stories of giants and spirits, of creation and destruction, of men born from salt and mist. In time, Christianity would reach their shores, carried by monks from the south. Yet even as the new faith took hold, the old reverence for nature remained. To the Frisians, the divine was never distant. It lived in the tides, in the storms, in the strange glow of the northern lights. The sacred and the earthly were one. And so the North Sea became more than a boundary. It became a shared heart. The Frisians, with their unmatched seamanship, helped shape this world, connecting it through trade and kinship, through migration and memory. Some of them even sailed across the sea to settle in the British Isles, blending their blood with that of the Saxons and Angles. In many ways, the England that emerged in the centuries to come bore traces of Frisia, not in the stories of conquest, but in the quieter legacies of law, language, and craft. To this day, archaeologists uncover evidence of Frisian trade and influence. Coins minted in Dorstad, combs carved from whalebone, textiles woven with patterns found from the Rhine to the Thames. Each fragment tells the same story, that the Frisians were bridges between worlds. And as night fell across the North Sea, when the lanterns of ships glimmered like stars upon the waves, it must have seemed, to those sailors who looked to the horizon, that there were no nations, no empires, only wind, salt, and the endless brotherhood of those who called the sea home. That world is gone now. The trade routes have changed, and the sails are gone. Yet, in the quiet villages along the Frisian coast, when the tide retreats and gulls wheel in the gray light of dawn, you can still feel it, that invisible bond stretching across the water, linking shore to shore. The North Sea still remembers its people, and the Frisians still remember the sea. Before the grand merchant leagues and mighty cities of the north, there were the Frisians, masters of the coast, merchants of the wind. Long before Lübeck rose, before the Hanseatic League stretched its web across the Baltic, the Frisian sailors had already charted the waters that others would later claim. Their ships, small, sturdy, and swift, cut through the gray swells like arrows. They carried not only goods, but trust, not just wealth, but knowledge of every current, every tide, every hidden shoal. For centuries, their sails were the lifeblood of northern Europe, connecting rivers to seas, markets to kingdoms, and people to one another. From their harbors, Dorstad, Stavern, Groningen, Emden, ships departed each dawn, laden with wool from England, salt from France, furs from the Baltic, and amber from the shores of Prussia. They brought back iron, grain, wine, and the delicate glass of the Rhineland. To walk the quays of a Frisian port in the 10th century was to stand at the crossroads of the medieval world. The air smelled of salt and tar, of fish and wet timber. Bells rang, ropes creaked, and voices mingled in a dozen tongues: Frisian, Old Norse, Frankish, Saxon, even Arabic, spoken by traders who followed the long rivers north from Spain and the Mediterranean. Unlike many of their contemporaries, the Frisians were not driven by conquest. They built no empire of soldiers, no walls of stone. Their empire was the sea itself, open, fluid, and shifting. Trade was their weapon, and trust was their shield. In an age when piracy and betrayal were common, the Frisians became known for their honesty and their skill in negotiation. Kings sought their ships. Monasteries relied on their goods. Even Viking chieftains respected their neutrality, for they knew that to harm a Frisian trader was to risk the flow of the world's commerce. It was said that a Frisian merchant could sail from the Loire to the Elbe and never once be treated as a foreigner. Their reputation preceded them like a banner. They were guests in every harbor and masters in none, the invisible architects of a connected world. The phrase Frisian faith became synonymous with fairness. In old charters and contracts, you'll still find it written, as true as a Frisian's word. But prosperity never comes without envy. The growing success of Frisian merchants drew the attention of powerful neighbors, the Counts of Flanders, the Dukes of Saxony, and the emerging cities of the south. As trade routes expanded, competition grew fierce. New ports like Hamburg and Bremen sought to control what the Frisians had built through centuries of patient seamanship. Yet the Frisians, ever resourceful, adapted again. They shifted their routes, forged new alliances, and continued to sail, no matter how the tides of politics turned. Their ships were different from the great cogs that would later dominate the seas. Sleek, flexible, and shallow-drafted, They could navigate both ocean waves and inland rivers. With these, the Frisians reached deep into Europe's heart, to Utrecht, Cologne, and beyond. They carried news as well as goods, linking the scattered realms of the early Middle Ages into a single, breathing network. They were, in a sense, the veins of the continent, pumping life through every shore they touched. And yet, for all their success, they remained humble in form. Their ports were not gilded cities like Venice or Constantinople. They were simple towns built on reclaimed marshland, where houses leaned into the wind and ships moored beside market squares of wood and stone. But to the world beyond, these modest harbors represented something far greater, the proof that commerce, cooperation, and courage could thrive without empire. When you stand today along the old docks of Harlingen or Dockham, you can still imagine it, the clatter of cargo, the laughter of sailors, the shouts in languages long dead. The sea breeze carries it faintly, as though the past never quite left. The Frisians ruled no kings, but they ruled the tides, and in that brief, golden age, they built a civilization not of power, but of motion, one carried endlessly forward by the wind. Long before the cross rose above the marshes, the Frisians looked to the sea and sky for their gods. Their world was bound by wind and water, restless, untamed, eternal. They prayed to Woden, Lord of wisdom and storms, whose ravens flew over the coasts, to Thunor, the thunderer, protector of sailors, to Freya, giver of love and harvest. Their faith was woven into their lives, carried in the rhythm of the waves, the creak of timbers, and the scent of salt on the air. Temples stood not as grand cathedrals of stone, but as wooden halls where light flickered through smoke and the murmur of prayers mingled with the sea's unending roar. But in the 8th century, new sails appeared on the horizon, not of merchants or raiders, but of missionaries. The Frisians, proud and free, found themselves at the crossroads of two worlds, the old pagan order and the expanding faith of Rome. The first to come were Irish monks, humble and soft-spoken, wandering barefoot from village to village with nothing but their faith and a wooden cross carved from their own hands. They spoke not of conquest, but of salvation, telling stories of a single God who walked the earth as a man, a God who calmed seas and spoke of peace. At first, the Frisians listened with polite curiosity, but little interest. Their gods had served them well. The sea still yielded its fish, the winds still carried their ships, and their families still thrived beneath the open sky. Yet the world around them was changing. To the south, the Franks had embraced Christianity under their mighty kings. To the east, Saxons and Thuringians were beginning to fall beneath the cross. The faith was spreading. Like a tide, slow, steady, and unstoppable. Then came Willibrord, the English missionary who became known as the Apostle to the Frisians. He arrived with a group of monks from Northumbria, landing at the mouth of the Rhine around 690 CE. Unlike others before him, Willibrord understood the heart of the Frisians, their love of freedom, their respect for honesty, their bond with the sea. He did not demand their obedience, he earned their trust. He learned their language, broke bread in their halls, and baptized children whose parents still whispered the names of old gods by moonlight. In the town of Utrecht, he built a church where once a temple to Woden had stood, not as a symbol of conquest, but of transformation. Yet faith never comes without resistance. Many Frisians, especially in the northern marshlands, clung fiercely to their old ways. They saw the new religion as a threat to their traditions, their independence, their very souls. When the missionary Boniface came decades later, felling sacred trees and burning idols, anger flared. In 754, near Dockham, Boniface was killed by a band of pagan Frisians, not out of cruelty, but out of conviction. To them, he was a destroyer of sacred things. His death, though tragic, marked a turning point, for even as blood was spilled, the message of his faith took root deeper still. Slowly, the old temples fell silent. The statues of Woden and Thunor were replaced by crosses of oak and iron. Priests began to bless ships before they sailed. Churches rose on the same windswept dunes where once stood altars to the sea gods. But beneath the hymns and prayers, something older lingered, a quiet reverence for nature, for fate, for freedom. The Frisians did not abandon their past, they wove it into their new faith. In their Christianity, one could still hear echoes of the surf, still feel the pull of ancient gods beneath the surface of new devotion. By the time Charlemagne's empire swept north, the Frisians had largely embraced the cross, though not always the crown that came with it. Their bishops preached loyalty to the emperor, but the people still kept their assemblies, still chose their leaders by vote, and still swore oaths by God and by the sea. It was a Christianity unlike any other, independent, pragmatic, and fiercely local. They built no great monasteries of marble, but simple churches that stood like watchtowers against the storms, where fishermen prayed before setting sail and widows lit candles for those lost to the deep. In time, their faith became part of their identity, as steadfast as their ships, as calm as the tide, and as resilient as the land they reclaimed from the sea. The old gods were gone, but their spirit lived on in every wave, every gust of wind, every act of courage upon the waters. And so, the Frisians became Christians, but they never ceased to be free. By the late 8th century, the world around the Frisians was no longer theirs alone. To the south, the thunder of hooves echoed across the plains as a new power rose, the empire of Charlemagne. His banners, embroidered with the golden eagle of Rome reborn, fluttered above an army that claimed to fight not merely for conquest, but for faith and order. To his followers, Charlemagne was the chosen sword of God, destined to bring unity to Christendom. To the Frisians, he was the shadow of empire, vast, unstoppable, and cold. At first, his messengers came with words, not weapons. They offered peace, protection, and trade, if the Frisians would swear allegiance to the emperor and accept his laws. But the Frisians had long lived without kings. Their loyalty belonged to their families, their clans, their land. The thought of bowing to a distant ruler, however holy his name, struck at the heart of who they were. When Charlemagne's envoys demanded taxes and oaths of fealty, the Frisians answered with silence. And when Frankish soldiers came to enforce those demands, silence turned to resistance. The first sparks of rebellion flared along the river Lauwers. Small bands of Frisians, armed with axes and spears, rose against the imperial garrisons stationed along their coast. They knew they could not face Charlemagne's legions in open battle, but they understood their homeland better than any foreign soldier. They fought from the bogs and dunes, striking swiftly, vanishing into the mist. For every Frankish outpost built, another burned in the night. Charlemagne responded as emperors always did, with overwhelming force. His armies marched north, burning villages, seizing hostages, baptizing entire communities at sword point. Yet for all his might, the emperor found the Frisians impossible to break. Their land itself seemed to fight with them, the marshes swallowing his cavalry, the tides drowning his bridges. The campaigns dragged on for years, consuming thousands of lives, until finally, exhaustion forced a kind of uneasy peace. But peace under Charlemagne was a fragile illusion. The Frisians were ordered to pay tribute, to send warriors to serve in the emperor's wars, to build roads for his armies. Some complied, others pretended to, while quietly plotting revenge. The tension boiled over in the rebellion of 782, when a charismatic leader named Widukind, a Saxon noble allied with the Frisians, led a great uprising against the empire. Together, the Saxons and Frisians struck deep into Frankish territory, torching outposts and slaying imperial soldiers. For a moment, it seemed as though the northern peoples might reclaim their freedom. Charlemagne's response was merciless. He crushed the rebellion with fire and iron, ordering mass executions that sent a chill through all of Europe. Entire villages were wiped from the map. Survivors were forced to swear oaths of eternal loyalty, while Frankish priests rededicated their lands in the emperor's name. Widukind was captured and baptized. Before the imperial court, a symbol of submission. Yet even in defeat, the spirit of the Frisians endured. In the decades that followed, they learned to survive beneath the empire's rule without surrendering their soul. They paid their taxes, built their churches, and served in the emperor's armies. But their loyalty was always conditional, always cautious. They followed the laws of Charlemagne only when they suited them, and when they didn't, they returned quietly to their own customs, their own justice, their own sense of freedom. Charlemagne's empire would eventually crumble under its own weight, but the Frisians endured. Long after his golden banners faded, they still held their assemblies in the open air, still governed by their own laws, and still called themselves the Free Frisians. The emperor's shadow had passed, but their defiance remained like a scar on history, proof that even the mightiest empire could not fully conquer the spirit of a free people. And so, as the 9th century dawned, the Frisians stood once more between worlds, subjects of a fallen empire, heirs to a fading faith, and guardians of a fragile freedom that would soon be tested again. For on the horizon, new sails appeared, darker, sharper, and far more ruthless than any they had seen before. The Vikings were coming. The dawn that rose over the North Sea in the 9th century was red with smoke. Villages that once woke to the calls of fishermen now stirred to the sound of horns, long, mournful notes rolling across the waves like thunder. The Frisians, who had long believed themselves masters of the sea, now found the sea turning against them. From the mists of the northern horizon came ships the likes of which few had ever seen, sleek, narrow, carved with dragon heads that seemed to snarl at the wind. The north had awakened, and it came with fire in its hands. The first attacks came swift and cruel. A small island monastery, a coastal farm, an unguarded trading port. The Vikings, struck not for conquest, but for gold and glory. Their long ships slid through river mouths and marshes with terrifying ease, their oars cutting silently through the fog. By the time the alarm bells rang from the churches, it was already too late. Roofs burned, markets fell silent, and those who lived by the sea learned to fear it. The Frisians, proud sailors themselves, recognized the brilliance of their new enemies. The Norsemen were not wild savages as the priests claimed. They were disciplined raiders, expert navigators who understood the rhythm of the tides as well as any Frisian ever had. They came from Denmark, Norway, and beyond, driven by hunger, ambition, and legend. To them, the Frisian coast was both a prize and a passage, a gateway to the rich heartlands of the Frankish kingdoms and the rivers that led deep into Europe. At first, the Frisians tried to resist. Local militias formed, armed with spears and the same axes they used to fell timber. Coastal watchmen lit beacons at night, warning villages inland of approaching fleets. But for every village defended, 2 more fell. The raiders struck with no pattern, no mercy, sometimes vanishing for months, then returning without warning. The Frisians soon realized that to survive, they could not fight the sea. They would have to master it once more. And so, the shipyards of Dorstad, Stavern, and Emden came alive. Carpenters and blacksmiths worked through the night, reforging the old Frisian merchant vessels into warships. They called them kagis, broad, sturdy ships that could carry men and shields and withstand the roughest of waves. While the Vikings ruled the open sea, the Frisians learned to fight them in the narrow estuaries, ambushing them as they came inland. In time, Frisian sailors began to earn a reputation of their own, as fearless traders, yes, but also as defenders of their coast. Still, the price of resistance was steep. Dorstad, once the shining jewel of Frisian trade, was burned again until it became nothing more than ash and memory. Monks who had once copied holy texts now fled to safer lands, carrying with them the chronicles of destruction. Villages disappeared beneath the tides, abandoned by those who could no longer bear the fear. And yet, the Frisians endured. They rebuilt, they adapted, they learned to navigate the chaos. By the late 9th century, the lines between raider and defender began to blur. Some Frisians joined the Vikings as allies or mercenaries, drawn by the promise of gold and adventure. Others negotiated peace, trading safety for silver. The sea had become both enemy and opportunity, a place where the strong could thrive and the weak could vanish. And amidst all the chaos, a strange transformation took place. The Frisians, once the victims of raids, began to learn from their enemies. Their ships became faster, their warriors fiercer, their leaders more cunning. They studied the Norse way of life, their discipline, their navigation, their unshakable belief in destiny, and turned those lessons into survival. By the turn of the century, the Frisians were no longer merely defending their coast. They were shaping the North Sea's future as traders, pirates, and peacekeepers all at once. The age of fire and iron had begun, a time when courage was currency and survival itself was victory. And though the Viking tide would one day ebb, it left behind a new kind of Frisian, hardened by storms, sharpened by battle, and forever tied to the sea that had both blessed and cursed them. They were no longer just the free people of the marshlands. They were the survivors of the North. The smoke of war had barely faded when the Frisians began to rebuild. Out of the ashes of burned villages and abandoned harbors, a new world began to stir, a world not ruled by kings or armies, but by trade winds and tides. The very sea that had once carried death and fire now carried opportunity. Where others saw danger, the Frisians saw routes, markets, and the promise of silver. The 10th century dawned with sails once again upon the horizon, but this time they were Frisian. Wide-bellied merchant ships glided over the North Sea, their hulls packed with furs from the north, salt and fish from their coasts, and fine cloth woven in their homes. The Frisians had rediscovered their greatest strength, the art of connection. From England to Denmark, from Flanders to the Baltic, their ships became the veins through which the lifeblood of trade flowed. The ruins of Dorstad gave birth to new ports, Stavern, Tiel, and Groningen among them, bustling with the noise of commerce. Here, languages mingled like the waves, Frisian, Saxon, Frankish, Norse, and even distant tongues from Slavic lands. Silver coins clinked in the hands of men who once wielded axes. Merchants haggled over barrels of salt herring, rolls of fine linen, and amber from the Baltic shores. The markets smelled of tar, seaweed, and roasted fish, humble scents that whispered of quiet prosperity. The Frisians' mastery of the sea made them indispensable. They were the middlemen of the North Sea, carrying goods between kingdoms still rebuilding from centuries of war. They traded English wool for Frankish wine, Scandinavian timber for Flemish cloth, and Baltic furs for coins minted in Aachen and Cologne. In time, their reputation spread so far that foreign kings sought their ships to carry goods and messages across treacherous waters. To be a Frisian merchant was to be part of an invisible empire, one built not by conquest, but by trust and skill. Yet what made the Frisians truly remarkable was not just their wealth, but their freedom. Unlike the feudal lords of the south, the Frisians answered to no king. Their land was governed by assemblies, gatherings of farmers, traders, and ship captains who decided their own laws. It was a democracy born from the sea, pragmatic and fierce. They called it Friesland, the Frisian freedom, and it became the soul of their identity. No count ruled them, no bishop commanded them. They were free men and women bound only by the tides and their word. Their laws reflected that same spirit. Justice was not dictated by a crown, but agreed upon by the people. When disputes arose, elders gathered beneath the open sky to listen, judge, and decide. A man's oath, sworn before his peers, was as binding as any royal decree. This independence was more than tradition. It was defiance, a quiet rebellion that echoed across centuries. But prosperity breeds envy, and freedom invites challenge. To the south, the counts of Holland and the bishops of Utrecht began to eye Frisian wealth with suspicion. To the east, Saxon nobles whispered that no people should live so free. And beyond the horizon, new trade leagues were forming, alliances that would soon challenge Frisian dominance over the seas. Yet for the moment, the Frisians stood unrivaled. In the great halls of Scandinavia, poets sang of their skill. In the markets of London, merchants praised their honesty. And across the lowlands, their ships became a symbol of resilience, weathered by storms, but never sunk. The Frisians had transformed the chaos of the Viking Age into a new order, an order of sails, silver, and shared ambition. As the 11th century approached, they had become the unspoken masters of the North Sea. Their freedom was not written on parchment, but carried in the wind, their power not in armies, but in the strength of their ships. From storm to storm, from age to age, they had turned survival into an art. The Frisians were no longer just survivors. They were the merchants of the northern world. By the 12th century, the North Sea had become a crossroads of ambition. Where once only Frisian sails ruled the waves, now fleets from far-off ports began to appear, sleek cogs flying banners of Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen. These were the merchants of the Hanseatic League, a powerful alliance of trading cities bound together by mutual protection and economic might. They brought order, efficiency, and ruthless competition, and the Frisians, for the first time in generations, found themselves facing rivals who knew the sea as well as they did. The Hanseatic League grew like a living network, stretching from London to Novgorod. It offered its members privileges, markets, and protection from pirates. Its ships sailed in convoys, guarded by armed escorts. Its merchants set standardized prices and demanded strict trade laws. To many rulers and traders, the Hansa represented progress, a disciplined, organized vision of commerce that could tame the chaos of the northern seas. But to the Frisians, it felt like a cage. Their way had always been older, simpler, freer. Each man traded by his own skill, each voyage decided by the crew that dared to make it. There were no councils, no bureaucracies, no foreign laws dictating their trade. To join the Hansa would mean submitting to its rules, and, by extension, to the growing influence of the German city-states behind it. So the Frisians resisted. They remained independent merchants, clinging to their freedom even as the League tightened its grip around the North Sea. At first, their defiance worked. The Frisians knew the coastal routes better than anyone. Their ships could sail into shallows where Hansa cogs dared not go. They built trading posts in the muddy estuaries and windswept islands, striking deals with local lords and towns beyond Hansa control. They became known as the smugglers of the North, trading without license, outmaneuvering monopolies, living by the tide and their wits. But such freedom came at a cost. The Hansa cities retaliated with blockades and tariffs. Ports that once welcomed Frisian ships began to close their harbors. In some towns, Frisian merchants were attacked, their goods confiscated, their names struck from trading records. The sea that had once been their ally was turning into a battlefield of invisible wars, wars of coin, influence, and law. Meanwhile, on land, new threats loomed. The Counts of Holland were expanding northward, seeking to bring the Frisian coast under their rule. Their armies marched through the reclaimed polders and dikes, building castles where once there had been only windmills and farms. The bishops of Utrecht, too, claimed divine right over the northern lands, sending both priests and soldiers to remind the Frisians that true obedience lay with God's church, and by extension, with their appointed rulers. But the Frisians did not bow. In every town, from Harlingen to Groningen, the old assemblies still met beneath the open sky. They raised their banners of the sea eagle and swore their oaths of freedom once more. Better to die free than to live as a serf. Farmers became soldiers, merchants became defenders. The same hands that built ships now wielded swords and spears. And though they lacked great fortresses, their strength lay in unity, in their refusal to yield. For a time, this defiance held. When Holland's armies advanced, they were met by militias fighting knee-deep in the marshes. When the bishops sent their tax collectors, they found their paths blocked by villages that simply disappeared into the fog. The Frisians fought not for conquest, but for survival, for the right to govern themselves as they always had. Yet even as they stood proud, the world was shifting beneath them. Trade was no longer measured in local deals, but in continental systems. Power belonged not to the independent sailor, but to the organized guild, the signed charter, the sealed agreement. The Frisians, for all their skill and courage, were beginning to look like relics of an older age, a people out of step with the relentless march of progress. And yet, even as their influence waned, their legend grew. To sailors from Norway to England, the Frisians were spoken of with respect and awe, the last of the true free traders, the stubborn mariners who refused to kneel before kings or merchants. They had been the first to tame the North Sea, and even as others claimed its riches, its soul still belonged to them. The Hanseatic League would dominate northern Europe for centuries, but the Frisians remained the quiet heartbeat beneath it all, weathered, defiant, and free. For though their ships grew fewer, their spirit endured, carried in every wind that swept across the North Sea. The 13th and 14th centuries were years of storm and iron. Across the lowlands, banners rose and fell like tides, each one claiming dominion over Frisian soil, each one met with the same fierce defiance. The world beyond their dikes had changed, but within those marshes and meadows, the ancient vow of freedom still burned bright. The Frisians were surrounded by lords, counts, and bishops who dreamed of conquest, yet they had no king, no nobles, and no standing army. They had only their will, their land, and each other. They called it the Wars of Freedom. It began with whispers, attacks here, a decree there, subtle attempts by neighboring powers to turn the Frisians into subjects. When words failed, swords followed. The first to strike was the Count of Holland, claiming the right to restore order in the north. His men marched behind banners of gold and blue, confident that the scattered farmers of Friesland would crumble at the sight of their armor. But the Frisians did not meet them on open fields. They lured them into the bogs, the ditches, the flooded polders where the heavy cavalry sank into the mud. From behind the reeds, they struck with axes, pikes, and stones, vanishing into the mist before the enemy could regroup. The Battle of Warnes in 1345 became legend. On a cold autumn day, Count William IV of Holland led his forces deep into Frisian territory, certain of victory. He never returned. The Frisians ambushed his army near Stavern, trapping them between the rising tides and their own burning ships. The Count himself fell in the chaos, struck down in the mud as his men fled. When word of his death reached Holland, it was said that even the sea went silent. For a brief moment, the impossible had happened. A small, leaderless people had defeated one of Europe's great lords. But freedom came at a cost. Victory brought not peace, but division. Without a central ruler, the Frisians began to quarrel among themselves. Families that had once stood shoulder to shoulder now fought for influence. Old rivalries between Eastern and Western Frisians flared into open conflict, fueled by pride and power. The land that had once united against invaders now fractured into factions, the Schieringers and the Vetkopers, each claiming to defend the true freedom of Friesland. It was a bitter irony. The very independence that had protected them for centuries now became their greatest weakness. Foreign powers saw opportunity in their chaos. The Dukes of Saxony offered protection, the bishops of Utrecht offered peace, and the merchants of Holland offered order. Behind every promise was a hidden chain. The Frisians, weary from endless feuds, began to lose what they had fought so hard to preserve. Still, they resisted. Even when their towns burned and their fields flooded, they refused to yield completely. In the north, small communities clung to the ancient laws, still meeting in open-air assemblies. The Upstalboom Oath, a vow that bound all Frisians to defend one another's freedom until death. The tree under which they gathered became a symbol of defiance, its roots deep in their soil, its branches reaching toward the heavens like a silent prayer. By the 15th century, the wars had taken their toll. Villages lay in ruin, trade routes were broken, and the tides reclaimed fields once wrestled from the sea. The Hanseatic cities grew richer, the counts of Holland stronger, and still the Frisians stood defiant. Their enemies called them stubborn, their poets called them brave. And though the day would come when their independence finally gave way to the weight of empires, the spirit that had carried them through 1,000 years of struggle refused to die. For in the heart of every Frisian, From the sailors of Harlingen to the farmers of Leeuwarden, there remained an unshakable truth that freedom was not something granted by kings or bishops, but something earned, defended, and lived. And even as the armies closed in, as the sea winds carried the scent of smoke and salt across the marshes, the Frisians stood firm beneath the darkening sky, their torches burning bright against the coming night. Because they knew one thing the world had forgotten. Empires fall, kings die, but freedom, true freedom, never surrenders. The 15th century crept upon Friesland like a gray mist rolling in from the North Sea, quiet at first, but heavy with the promise of change. The wars of brother against brother had drained the land of its strength, and the songs of freedom that once echoed across the meadows had grown faint beneath the weight of weariness. In the markets of Groningen and the halls of Leeuwarden, merchants whispered of new powers rising, of Saxon lords, foreign banners, and treaties written not in the open air, but in candlelit rooms where no farmer's voice could reach. The world was shifting, and the Frisians, long masters of their own fate, could feel the tide turning against them. The first to come were the envoys of Duke Albert of Saxony. They spoke the language of peace, of protection, of unity, of bringing order to a land torn by feud. But beneath their polished words lay the echo of steel. By 1498, Albert's soldiers marched across Frisian fields, their armor gleaming like cold mirrors of conquest. The Frisians fought, as they always had, with courage born of defiance. Yet this time, the battle was not against a distant count or rival clan. It was against an army of the empire itself. The struggle was fierce but short. The cities of Friesland, long proud of their freedom, fell one by one. Leeuwarden bowed first, then Sneek, then Franeker. Only the remote regions of East Friesland and the marshy north still clung to the old ways, their people gathering in secret to swear the oaths of the Upstalboom once more. But even there, the old system of law and assembly began to fade. The Saxons replaced the 17 judges of freedom with imperial magistrates. Their decrees carried the seal of the emperor, not the voice of the people. To many Frisians, it was not just the end of independence, it was the end of an identity. For centuries, they had lived by a code unlike any other in Europe. They had no king, no serfs, no castles looming over their fields. Their laws were spoken aloud beneath open skies, their justice weighed by peers, not princes. Even their language, old, rhythmic, and proud, carried the memory of waves and wind. To lose that freedom was to lose a piece of themselves. And yet, even in defeat, they refused to vanish. In the dark corners of taverns, old men told tales of the battles at Warns and Boxholm, of the fearless farmers who once stood against the armies of Holland and Saxony. Children grew up hearing that their ancestors had never been conquered, only betrayed by time. The phrase, "Liever die as slave," better dead than a slave, became a whisper passed from generation to generation, a promise that one day, the spirit of freedom would rise again. Under Saxon rule, Friesland changed. Roads were built, trade revived, and cities flourished once more, but something vital, something sacred, had been lost. The fields were the same, the sea still thundered against the dikes, yet the air felt heavier, as if the land itself mourned what had been taken. Farmers still gathered after harvest to share ale and stories, but their laughter was quieter, their songs older. They spoke not of kings or emperors, but of the time when every man stood equal beneath the sky. And through all of it, the sea remained their silent witness. It had always been their companion, sometimes their enemy, always their mirror. The tides came and went, washing over the shorelines where so many battles had been fought, erasing footprints, but not memory. For the Frisians understood something few others did. Freedom is not a crown you can wear, nor a border you can draw on a map. It is a wind, unseen but felt, a thing that lives in the heart, long after banners have fallen. By the dawn of the 16th century, Friesland was no longer the land of the free. The Saxon dukes had sold their rights to the Habsburgs, and soon, The Emperor Charles V would fold the province into his vast dominion. Yet even then, in the smallest villages, in the quiet rhythm of waves against the shore, the old words endured. The people remembered. The spirit of the Upstalboom, of those who had once gathered beneath the open sky to swear freedom, still whispered through the reeds. And though their independence had been taken, their story, their soul, remained untouched. The dawn of the 16th century cast long shadows across Friesland. The Saxon banners were gone, but in their place rose the double-headed eagle of the Habsburgs, an empire vast enough to stretch from the lowlands of the Netherlands to the mountains of Spain. To most Frisians, it was as if a faraway storm had settled over them, not raging, but ever present, humming faintly in the distance. They were no longer a free people, yet they were not conquered in spirit. Beneath the heavy weight of imperial rule, something old began to stir again, quiet, unseen, like the tide returning after the storm. Under Charles V, Friesland was absorbed into the Burgundian Netherlands, a province among many. Taxes flowed south toward Brussels, and the emperor's edicts arrived sealed in wax and written in a language that few farmers could read. The ancient Upstalboom law was replaced by the statutes of empire. Local councils answered to appointed governors rather than their own assemblies. And yet, the Frisians adapted, not by surrendering their identity, but by transforming it. If they could no longer wield swords in defense of their freedom, they would wield trade, language, and craft instead. It was in the bustling harbors of Harlingen and Dokkum that this quiet rebirth began. Ships set sail once more for England and the Baltic, laden with wool, cheese, and salt, the lifeblood of the northern seas. Frisian sailors became renowned for their skill, their courage, and their uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous sandbanks that had swallowed so many foreign vessels. They spoke the language of every coast they visited, Dutch, English, Low German. Yet among themselves, they whispered in Frisian, their mother tongue carried like a secret melody across the waves. The sea, which had always been both their master and their mirror, gave them purpose again. And through trade, the Frisians began to connect with the world beyond their dikes. Hanseatic merchants, English captains, and Danish fishermen met them in crowded ports, where the air smelled of tar and salt and opportunity. These encounters did something remarkable. They reminded the Frisians that though their land was small, their reach was boundless. Freedom, they realized, could not be taken from those who carried it within. But even as the spirit of trade flourished, the shadow of empire loomed large. The Habsburg governors ruled with calculation and suspicion, wary of the independence that still simmered beneath Frisian calm. New laws sought to standardize justice, language, and faith, the pillars of control. When the Reformation began to sweep across Europe, bringing both hope and turmoil, Friesland became a land divided once more. Some clung to the old faith, others embraced the teachings of Luther and Calvin, but most cared little for theological wars. What mattered to them was the freedom to choose, the same freedom their ancestors had died to protect. In this age of shifting powers and broken alliances, the Frisians learned a quiet wisdom. Survival is not always found in rebellion, but in endurance. They did not rise in great revolts like the Flemings or the Dutch. Yet when the 80 Years' War against Spanish rule broke out, many Frisians fought, not for empire, but for the dream of self-rule once more. In towns like Franeker and Bolsward, scholars and poets began to write again in their native tongue, reviving old sagas and songs long thought forgotten. Their words carried not defiance, but remembrance, a gentle, persistent flame that refused to go out. By the late 16th century, Friesland stood as part of the newly independent Dutch Republic, a land reborn from rebellion. Though it was now bound to the United Provinces, the Frisians retained their own laws, their own courts, and their own voice in the States General, a small echo of their ancient freedom. It was not the old Republic of the Upstalboom, but it was something alive, something real, and through it, the memory of who they once were continued to breathe. The world had changed beyond recognition. The age of empires had begun, and the sails that crossed the oceans now bore flags unknown to their ancestors. Yet in Friesland, between the whispering reeds and the endless sky, the people still listened to the sea. Its song had not changed. It still spoke of freedom, not the freedom of crowns or conquests, but the kind that lives quietly in the soul, unbroken by time or tyranny. And so, beneath the shadow of great powers, the Frisians endured, not as conquerors or rebels, but as keepers of memory. Theirs was not a history of triumph, but of persistence, the soft, steady heartbeat of a people who refused to be forgotten. The dawn of the 17th century brought to Friesland not the clash of swords, but the hum of industry, the whisper of pens, and the creak of masts in wind-filled harbors. The long centuries of struggle and rebellion had given way to a different kind of power, quieter, gentler, but no less profound. The Dutch Republic, newly freed from Spanish rule, was rising as one of Europe's great maritime powers, and Friesland, that northern land of flat horizons and vast skies, found itself part of an empire of trade, ideas, and discovery. Yet even within this union, the Frisians remained distinctly themselves, pragmatic, proud, and unshaken by grandeur. The old towns of Leeuwarden, Harlingen, and Franeker began to thrive again, their markets filled with spices from the east, wool from England, and timber from the Baltic. Ships built in Frisian yards sailed under the Dutch flag, but their captains spoke with the soft, rolling accent of the northern coast. Harlingen became a gateway to the world, its docks echoing with the calls of sailors and merchants, its taverns filled with stories of Java, Suriname, and distant African coasts. Though few Frisians sought glory in conquest or colonization, their craftsmanship and seafaring skill made them indispensable to the Republic's growing power. But trade was only part of the story. In the quiet town of Franeker, a new kind of freedom was taking root, the freedom of the mind. The University of Franeker, founded in 1585, became a beacon of learning in the north, attracting scholars from across Europe. Within its modest lecture halls, ideas once forbidden under imperial rule now flowed like fresh wind from the sea. Theologians debated faith and reason, astronomers charted the heavens, and philosophers asked questions no ruler could silence. It was here that the spirit of the old Upstalboom, the love of open discourse and shared judgment, found its rebirth not in politics, but in thought. One figure who embodied this new age was Izinga, a humble wool carder from Franeker. In the late 18th century, long after the university's founding, he would build a working model of the solar system, the Izinga Planetarium, inside his own home. Crafted by hand from wood, brass, and patience, it remains the oldest operating planetarium in the world. In that quiet miracle of gears and stars lay the essence of Friesland itself, precision born of humility, knowledge shaped by labor, and wonder grounded in simplicity. The universe, Izinga proved, could be understood not by kings or empires, but by the hands of ordinary people. The arts, too, found their place among these lowlands. Frisian painters captured the stillness of the landscape, the silver light over canals, the vast sky reflected in wet meadows, the geometry of dikes and villages. Their work lacked the grandiose drama of the southern masters, but it held something rarer: peace. It was the same peace found in the rhythm of the tides, in the patient care of farmers tending their fields, in the calm resilience of a people long accustomed to the weight of history. And though Friesland was now part of a republic that stretched across oceans, its people never lost sight of home. The Frisian language, once threatened by foreign rule, quietly endured, spoken in cottages, sung in lullabies, and written in local chronicles. In a world growing louder with the sounds of empire and industry, the Frisians remained soft-spoken, yet their words carried centuries of memory. Their identity was not a banner to be raised, but a flame to be protected, steady, unwavering, eternal. Even the sea seemed gentler in those years. The great storms still came, and the dikes still demanded the labor of many hands, but there was a sense of harmony now, a rhythm between people and nature. The same spirit that had once fought for survival was now devoted to preservation. Villages built new flood defenses, engineers perfected the art of water management, and farmers learned to coax life from the earth without defiance. In every blade of grass and every drop of water, the Frisians honored their oldest ally and oldest enemy, the sea. By the close of the 17th century, Friesland had entered what historians call its quiet golden age. There were no great conquests, no dynasties, no cathedrals of marble and gold. But there was something far more enduring: balance. The land, the people, and the sea existed in rare harmony, bound together by centuries of resilience and faith. And though empires rose and fell around them, the Frisians, with their calm eyes, patient hearts, and unshakable freedom, endured as they always had. The 18th century drifted over Friesland like a long, tranquil tide. The wars that had once shaken Europe seemed far away now, muffled echoes beyond the horizon. In the soft light of dawn, mist rose from the canals, and windmills turned lazily over fields as they had for centuries. The villages were calm, the meadows green, and the sea, ever restless, ever near, whispered against the shore as if in contentment. To a traveler passing through Leeuwarden or Franeker, Friesland must have seemed like a land suspended in time, untouched by the chaos that rumbled through the rest of Europe. But beneath that stillness, something subtle was shifting. The world beyond the dikes was growing louder, faster, hungrier. Machines were beginning to hum in England's factories. Philosophers in France were dreaming of revolution. Kings and empires plotted borders on maps that reached across oceans. Trade routes expanded. Ships grew larger, and cities far to the south swelled with the pulse of progress. The age of quiet craft and slow journeys was fading, and though Friesland remained tranquil, it could not remain untouched. The merchants of Harlingen noticed it first. Where once the harbors had been alive with sails and shouted deals, the docks now felt quieter. The great trading companies, the VOC and Wick, were shifting power toward Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and smaller ports like Harlingen felt the loss like a slow-ebbing tide. The Frisians continued to build ships, fine and strong as ever, but the world no longer revolved around the steady rhythm of their hands. The age of maritime simplicity was being replaced by the age of industrial might. And yet, in that change, there was resilience. The Frisians, who had survived floods, wars, and centuries of foreign rule, did not despair. They adapted. Farmers turned to new crops, experimenting with methods of drainage and soil management that would soon make Friesland one of the most fertile regions in the Republic. Artisans refined their crafts, and scholars continued their studies in Franeker and beyond, quietly contributing to the Enlightenment of Europe. While cities elsewhere flared with revolution, Friesland remained steady, cautious, thoughtful, content to move at its own pace. Still, there were moments when the calm felt fragile. The storms that swept the coast seemed stronger now, the tides less predictable. In 1717, a great flood struck, the Christmas flood, devastating much of the northern Netherlands and parts of Germany. Entire villages were washed away, thousands perished in a single night. The sea, as if reminding its children of who truly ruled these lands, had broken through the dikes with a fury unseen in generations. When the waters finally receded, they left behind silence and a renewed respect. The Frisians rebuilt once more, as they always had, stronger and wiser than before. But something deeper lingered, the awareness that peace was never permanent, only borrowed. Leeuwarden, once a provincial capital of modest charm, began to glow with quiet sophistication. Canals gleamed beneath arching bridges, and the gables of merchant houses reflected in the water like painted memories. It was in these streets that the soft murmur of the Enlightenment took hold, not through rebellion, but through curiosity. Books flowed in from Amsterdam, Paris, and London, and in cozy parlors lit by candlelight, men and women debated philosophy, science, and the strange new notion that all people might be born equal. The Frisians, ever practical, embraced these ideas not with fire, but with reason, weighing them as they would the tides. And yet, as the century waned, whispers of restlessness grew. Taxes increased, trade declined, and foreign wars drained the Republic's treasury. In the taverns of Harlingen and Dokkum, old sailors spoke of how the Dutch flag no longer commanded fear on the seas, and young men wondered if the glory of the Republic was fading. For the first time in generations, uncertainty crept across the flat horizon. The stillness that had once felt like peace now felt almost like waiting. It was as if Friesland stood at the edge of two worlds, one fading, one just beginning to awaken. The fields were as green as ever, the windmills still turned, and the sea still sang its eternal song. But in that song, beneath the familiar rhythm of waves, there was a new note, low, distant, and growing louder. The world was changing, and the Frisians, for all their steadiness, could feel it in their bones. They did not yet know that before the century ended, revolutions would sweep across Europe, empires would collapse, and the very idea of freedom would be reborn in fire and blood. But for now, the land of dikes and meadows slept beneath its wide northern sky, quiet, beautiful, and unaware that its greatest test was yet to come. By the closing years of the 18th century, the quiet calm that had blanketed Friesland for generations began to tremble. The still waters of the canals reflected a sky filled not with peace, but with gathering storm clouds, both real and symbolic. Across Europe, monarchs were falling, cities were burning, and words once whispered in salons and universities now echoed from the mouths of the masses: freedom, equality, brotherhood. For a people who had built their identity around freedom, these words stirred something deep within the Frisian heart. Yet the freedom now being spoken of was not the same as the one of the Upstalboom or the quiet independence of the dike builders. It was louder, sharper, the kind that demanded not patience, but revolution. And revolution, as the Frisians would soon learn, was a storm that spared no one. The Dutch Republic, weary and fragmented, was already unraveling under the weight of corruption and decay. The wealthy regents in Amsterdam clung to privilege, while the common people demanded change. Friesland, though distant from the centers of power, felt the rumblings. Pamphlets printed in secret found their way north, carrying the fiery words of the patriots, a movement calling for democracy, for the end of oligarchy, for a new republic that would belong to the people. In Leeuwarden, small groups began to meet behind closed doors, merchants, scholars, and even a few farmers, discussing the winds of change blowing from France and America. The spirit of freedom, dormant for centuries, began to stir once more. But as with all revolutions, unity was fleeting. Old rivalries, class divisions, and fear of the unknown tore at the fragile fabric of progress. Then came the year 1795. The French armies, led by General Pichegru, marched into the frozen Netherlands. The once mighty Dutch fleet lay trapped in ice, and in a strange twist of fate, French cavalry rode across the frozen sea to capture it. A scene so unreal it felt like a vision from myth. The Dutch Republic collapsed without a battle. In its place, the Batavian Republic was born, a puppet state under French protection but wrapped in the language of liberty. To many in Friesland, this seemed a strange echo of the past, a foreign power arriving in the name of freedom. Yet unlike the Saxons or the Habsburgs, the French brought not crowns, but ideas. The ancient feudal remnants were swept away, the guilds were abolished. New laws promised equality before the state. For a brief moment, it seemed the old dream of Frisian freedom had returned, reborn in the language of revolution. But the reality was far harsher. The taxes grew heavier, the conscriptions relentless, and the promises of liberty soon drowned beneath the noise of war. France demanded soldiers, and Friesland's young men marched south, many never to return. Trade faltered under the weight of blockades, and hunger crept into the towns. The dikes still held, but the hearts of the people grew weary once more. And then, as swiftly as it had come, the Batavian dream gave way to empire. Napoleon Bonaparte rose from general to emperor in Friesland, along with the rest of the Netherlands. was absorbed into his vast dominion. The French flag flew over Leeuwarden, and the people who had once answered only to the sea now answered to Paris. The ancient Frisian law was replaced by the Napoleonic Code. Justice became efficient, but cold. Yet even in the shadow of empire, the old resilience remained. The Frisians did not rebel, not with swords or fire, but with endurance. They endured the taxes, the conscriptions, the foreign tongue, and the endless wars that devoured Europe. And when Napoleon finally fell in 1815, they were still standing, scarred, quieter than before, but unbroken. The world that emerged from the Napoleonic Wars was not the same one their ancestors had known. Kingdoms had risen and fallen, maps had been redrawn, and Friesland found itself part of a new nation, the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It was a monarchy, something the free Frisians had never truly known, yet this time, they accepted it not as a surrender, but as a compromise. For freedom, they had learned, is not always won in battle or law. Sometimes, it survives in the quiet persistence of those who refuse to forget who they are. When the smoke of the Napoleonic Wars cleared, the continent sighed as if waking from a fever dream. Europe's crowned heads gathered in Vienna to stitch together what war had torn apart, and from their careful diplomacy emerged a new order, the Kingdom of the Netherlands. For the first time in history, Friesland was no longer a semi-independent province shifting between foreign rulers. It was now a part of a unified Dutch kingdom under King William I. The promise was stability, prosperity, and peace. But for a people who had cherished freedom above all else, it was also a quiet reckoning. The early decades of the 19th century in Friesland were not marked by war or rebellion, but by adjustment. The Frisians, pragmatic as ever, accepted the new reality with the same stoic calm that had carried them through centuries of floods and conquest. Their fields, reclaimed from the sea by generations of dike builders, once again became the backbone of their economy. The markets of Leeuwarden and Harlingen bustled with life, butter, cheese, and cattle flowing south toward Amsterdam and beyond. The sea routes revived, and merchant ships once again carried Frisian goods across the North Sea to England and Scandinavia. But while trade prospered, something deeper stirred beneath the surface, a quiet yearning to preserve what made Friesland Friesland. The kingdom's rulers in The Hague sought to standardize language, administration, and law, unifying the provinces under one identity. Dutch became the language of the courts, schools, and government offices. Frisian, once the language of law and legend, began to fade from official use. It was still spoken in villages and farmhouses, but to many, it seemed destined to vanish into memory, like so many medieval tongues before it. Yet the Frisians, though quiet, were not complacent. A cultural awakening began to take root in the heart of this new order. In the 1830s and 1840s, scholars, poets, and teachers, inspired by the Romantic movement sweeping Europe, began to rediscover their heritage. They collected old songs, transcribed oral histories, and wrote poetry in Frisian once more. One of them, Justice H. Halbertsma, became the voice of this rebirth. With his brothers, he compiled De Frisk Rijmelary, a collection of Frisian poems and tales that celebrated the humor, strength, and stubborn spirit of their people. This revival was not just literary. It was emotional, a declaration that the Frisians had survived every empire, every conqueror, and every tide of change because they remembered who they were. Their freedom might no longer lie in law or arms, but it lived on in language, story, and song. Villages once divided by distance were bound again by a shared tongue. Children learned the tales of Redbad, the pagan king who had defied Charlemagne, and of the medieval assemblies where free men had once governed themselves. Meanwhile, the landscape itself became a symbol of endurance. The windmills, tall, stoic silhouettes against the endless horizon, continued their eternal dance with the wind, pumping water from the fields to keep the land alive. Each creak of the wooden gears, each rhythmic sweep of the sails, seemed to whisper the same message the Frisians had carried for centuries. We endure because we adapt. As the century progressed, modernity crept closer. Railways reached Leeuwarden. Telegraphs connected even the remotest villages, and steamships replaced the sturdy sailing vessels that had once defined Frisian trade. Change came quickly, but the Frisians faced it with a familiar calm. They did not resist progress. They shaped it to their rhythm, their pace. Farmers modernized their tools, but kept their communal traditions. Sailors embraced steam, but still blessed their ships before each voyage, as their ancestors had done under the eyes of ancient gods. The world beyond Friesland was changing, but inside its dikes, a delicate balance held. The people worked, traded, prayed, and sang. Their lives simple, yet bound by something timeless. Though no longer free in the political sense, Friesland had become a kingdom within a kingdom, a land defined not by borders or crowns, but by memory. By the end of the 19th century, the Frisian language was again taught in schools. Local festivals celebrated ancient customs. The old seal of the Fries Vrijheid, the Frisian freedom, was displayed proudly on banners during cultural gatherings. It was no longer the freedom of swords and charters, but of the spirit, the freedom to remember, to belong, to endure. And so, beneath the quiet skies of the northern plains, the Frisians continued their eternal conversation with the wind and the sea, guardians of a memory too deep to drown, too strong to fade. As the 20th century dawned, the world roared to life with iron and steam. Across Europe, factories rose where fields once lay, and cities pulsed with the restless hum of industry. Even in Friesland, where the horizon had always belonged to windmills and water, the age of machines began to arrive, slow but steady, like a tide creeping over the marshes. The old rhythm of the land was changing. Canals that had once carried sailing barges now saw the smoke of steamships. The smell of salt and peat mingled with coal dust. The sound of the windmill's creak was joined by the low hiss of engines. Yet the Frisians, ever pragmatic, embraced this new age with the same cautious wisdom they had shown for centuries. Harlingen's harbor grew busier, exporting butter, cheese, and cattle to Britain and importing goods from across the seas. Leeuwarden became a center of trade and administration, its streets lined with merchants, craftsmen, and scholars. The railway connected Friesland to Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and beyond, opening its markets and its people to the modern world. But through all this change, the countryside, wide, quiet, and endless, still held to its timeless rhythm. Farmers rose with the dawn, their boots sinking into damp soil that had once been sea. The dikes, those eternal guardians, stood firm against the storms. Every winter brought the same ritual: ice creeping across the canals, villages connecting by frozen bridges, and children learning to skate before they could even walk. The Elfstedentocht, the legendary 11 Cities tour, became a symbol of pride, where thousands of skaters raced across the frozen waterways that linked Friesland's ancient towns. It wasn't just a race. It was a celebration of endurance, a living echo of the Frisian spirit that had defied centuries of hardship. But soon, the peace that had defined the 19th century gave way to darker winds. In 1914, the world descended into chaos. Though the Netherlands remained neutral during the First World War, Friesland felt the tremors. Refugees from Belgium flooded north, seeking safety across the border. Trade faltered, and shortages crept through even the quietest villages. The Frisian people, practical, resilient, endured once again, sharing what they could, repairing what was broken, and waiting for the storm to pass. When it finally did, the modern age came rushing in faster than ever. Automobiles replaced horses, radios carried voices from London and Berlin, and electric lights began to glow where once only candlelight flickered. Friesland stood at a crossroads, its tradition strong, but the world around it speeding beyond recognition. Old farmhouses now had telephones. Young men and women left the land to work in the growing cities of the West. Still, the language, the heart of the Frisian identity, remained alive, passed down like a secret melody, whispered across generations. Then, in 1940, the sky darkened again. The German army swept across the Netherlands, and Friesland, quiet, flat, and open, fell under occupation. The people who had always valued freedom now faced its loss in the most brutal form. But even under the shadow of war, their spirit did not bend. Resistance networks formed in barns and backrooms. Fishermen smuggled refugees and soldiers across the Wadden Sea to safety in England. Farmers hid fugitives beneath floorboards. In the villages and fields, the Frisians resisted not with swords, but with silence, cunning, and courage. When liberation finally came in 1945, it came with tears, songs, and a deep breath of relief. The land that had seen so many storms, both of water and of men, was free again. The people rebuilt quickly, as they always had. Fields were restored, dikes repaired, homes rebuilt. But something profound had changed. The Frisians understood now, more than ever, that their freedom was not just a word from the past. It was a living inheritance. In the years that followed, Friesland entered the modern age with quiet strength. Industry expanded. Dairies, shipyards, and textile mills flourished. Education grew. Roads stretched across the plains. Yet even as the Netherlands became one of Europe's most advanced nations, Friesland held to its soul. In 1956, the Frisian language was officially recognized again in schools and courts. A victory long in the making. Songs, poetry, and festivals filled the air, and the voice of an ancient people echoed proudly once more. And as night fell across the flat northern land, with windmills silhouetted against the dying light, one could still hear the faint whisper of the old motto, "Liever day as slave." Better dead than enslaved. It was more than a saying. It was a promise, one kept for over 1,000 years. In the quiet light of the modern age, Friesland no longer stands as a battlefield of empires or a frontier of faith, and yet its story continues, alive in every ripple of water and every breath of wind that rolls across the flat horizon. The sea that once threatened to swallow it now glimmers peacefully against the dikes, a reminder of centuries of defiance and labor. The land, reclaimed, defended, and cherished, remains both a home and a monument to endurance. Modern Friesland is not a relic of the past. It is a living continuation of everything the Frisians ever were, free, stubborn, and deeply connected to their roots. By the mid-20th century, Friesland had entered a new era of renewal. The scars of war healed beneath the rhythm of daily life. Villages rebuilt their churches and halls. Children returned to schools, and fishermen once again pushed their boats into the Wadden Sea, their nets glistening in the dawn. But this was no mere return to the old ways. Technology and tradition began to intertwine. The ancient skill of water management evolved into modern engineering. Dutch and Frisian scientists worked side by side, turning centuries of experience with dikes and wind into one of the world's most advanced systems of flood control. Friesland, once a vulnerable coastline, had become a model of resilience for the entire world. Yet, through every change, the Frisians never forgot the value of identity. The 1960s and 1970s brought a wave of cultural revival, not born from rebellion, but from remembrance. Folk songs were sung again in Frisian, theaters performed plays in the old language, and poets filled the airways with verses that sounded like echoes of the sea. The language, long pushed to the margins, reclaimed its rightful place in schools, on street signs, and in the hearts of the people. In 1980, the Frisian flag, blue and white stripes adorned with red, pompelbolden, the stylized water lily leaves, became a proud symbol seen in homes, schools, and sports fields alike. It was more than decoration. It was a quiet proclamation, we are still here. Leeuwarden, the ancient capital, became the heart of this modern renaissance. Its cobbled streets, once trod by merchants and knights, now hummed with artists, musicians, and thinkers. In 2018, when Leeuwarden was named the European Capital of Culture, the world once again turned its eyes northward, to a province that had never sought greatness, yet had achieved it through endurance and authenticity. Visitors came to see not grand palaces or ancient battlefields, but a way of life, a landscape where nature, history, and community moved as one. But even in modern times, the eternal battle with water remains. Rising sea levels and fierce storms test the dikes that have protected Friesland for generations. Each winter brings new floods to fend off, new challenges to overcome. Yet, as always, the Frisians face these tides not with fear, but with innovation. Wind turbines now rise beside traditional mills, harnessing the same invisible power that once filled their sails. Sustainable farming, green energy, and coastal preservation are not just policies here. They are continuations of the same ancient pact between land and sea that has defined the Frisian soul since the dawn of history. To walk through Friesland today is to walk through layers of time. The markets of Dokkum, the canals of Sneek, the harbors of Harlingen, they all breathe with a calm familiarity that bridges past and present. Children speak Dutch at school, Frisian at home, and the language of the wind wherever they go. Farmers still tend their cattle on land their ancestors once pulled from the sea. Sailors still look to the horizon, knowing that the same waters that once carried their forefathers to England and Norway still whisper beneath the waves. And when night falls, the same stars shine over Friesland that once guided the longboats of its first settlers. The wind sighs softly through the reeds, and if you listen closely, past the hum of the turbines, past the faint echoes of modern life, you can still hear it, the timeless murmur of the Frisians' promise. They have endured every tide, every conqueror, every storm. They have bent, but never broken. Because to be Frisian is not to rule, nor to be ruled. It is simply to remain. There are nights in Friesland when the sea seems to breathe, slow and deep, like a living creature dreaming beneath the moon. The wind drifts across the fields, carrying the faint scent of salt and grass, and the air hums with something ancient, something that has never left. For in this land where earth and water are forever entwined, memory is not confined to books or monuments. It lives in the rhythm of the tides, in the whisper of reeds, in the language that refuses to die. The Frisians have always said that the sea remembers. They tell stories of drowned villages, swallowed whole by the waves during the great floods, whose church bells can still be heard on stormy nights, tolling faintly beneath the water. They speak of the lost lands of Magna Frisia, once said to stretch from the Rhine to the Weser, now hidden beneath the sea's restless skin. And they remember Redbad, their last pagan king, who, when asked to convert, refused the promise of heaven if it meant being separated from his ancestors in hell. To the Frisians, Redbad is not merely a figure of history. He is the spirit of defiance itself, the embodiment of freedom that cannot be bought or broken. These legends are not told with loud voices or grand gestures. They are murmured beside fireplaces, whispered to children at night, sung in the lilting tones of old Frisian ballads that float like mist across the fields. The past is not something distant here. It walks beside the present, quiet and constant. Every dike and canal carries the mark of hands that have shaped this land for over 1,000 years. Every name on the map, Sneek, Dokkum, Franeker, feels like an echo from another time, resonating still. As the modern world rushes forward, as cities rise, as languages blend, as the boundaries of identity blur, the Frisians continue to hold their place between land and sea. They do not cling to the past out of nostalgia, but out of reverence. Because to them, history is not a story that ended. It is a dialogue still unfolding. The sea, after all, never stops moving, and neither do they. In folklore, it is said that the gods of the North Sea, the spirits of water and wind, grew fond of the Frisians, not because they were mighty, but because they were patient. They built, fell, rebuilt, and endured, not with pride, but with quiet faith that the land and the people were meant to belong to one another. Even now, when a storm howls across the coast and the waves crash against the dikes, there is no panic, only preparation, calm, and a subtle, unspoken trust that the balance will hold. It is as if the sea itself respects them for never giving up. And perhaps that is what the legacy of the Frisians truly is. Not their trade routes, not their brief kingdoms, not even their fabled freedom, but their harmony with forces larger than themselves. Where other peoples sought to conquer nature, the Frisians chose to understand it. They learned to live with the sea, not against it, to read its moods, to predict its tempers, to build not walls of arrogance, but defenses of wisdom. That is why their story endures, because it is not only a tale of history, but of coexistence. When you stand on the edge of the Wadden Sea at dusk, watching the tide pull back across the flats, you can almost feel it, that quiet pulse beneath your feet, the heartbeat of 1,000 years. The gulls cry above, the wind carries the scent of brine and earth, and somewhere in that endless sound, you can hear the voices of all who came before: farmers, sailors, monks, kings, rebels, and dreamers, all speaking the same simple truth. We are still here. The sea remembers them. And so, the world must remember too. There is something eternal about the horizon in Friesland. It stretches endlessly, a line between sea and sky that never quite meets, like the boundary between past and present, always near, never closed. As the sun dips low, the world here softens into silver and gold. The marshlands shimmer with quiet light. The air smells faintly of salt and heather, and the wind carries whispers that seem older than time itself. In moments like these, the land feels alive, not just with people, but with memory. If you listen carefully, you might still hear the faint rhythm of oars in the distance, echoes of Frisian ships that once sailed to England, Denmark, and Norway, their sails swelling with the same winds that now brush against your face. You can almost see them, lean wooden vessels, their hulls creaking against the waves, their crews singing songs in a language that has never died. They are long gone, and yet not gone at all. Their spirit lingers here, on this quiet coast, where water and sky blur into a single infinite expanse. Friesland's horizon has always been its truth, open, limitless, untamed. It has shaped the people who live beneath it, teaching them patience and humility, reminding them that no wall can hold back the sea forever. The Frisians learned long ago that strength lies not in defiance, but in balance. They built their lives not around domination, but coexistence, between land and water, faith and freedom, memory and change. As centuries passed and the world beyond grew louder, with machines, wars, and empires, Friesland remained a place of stillness, a quiet rhythm within Europe's restless heart. Its landscape is not one of grandeur or monument, but of persistence, windmills turning slowly against the sky, cattle grazing beneath vast clouds, canals glinting like veins of light through the green. It is a land that asks nothing but patience, and in return, it gives peace. There's a kind of poetry in that, a wisdom that feels almost ancient. While kingdoms rose and fell, while borders shifted and thrones crumbled, Friesland endured by being itself. No crown, no empire, no doctrine could erase its way of life, because it was not written in law or ink. It was written in the soil, the tides, and the hearts of its people. The horizon became their scripture, a promise that no matter how far the world advanced, the spirit of freedom, simplicity, and endurance would remain. Today, travelers who come to Friesland often describe the same sensation, a feeling of calm that seems to rise from the earth itself. They walk along the dikes, watching the tides roll in slow and steady, and they feel time stretch. The rush of the modern world fades. The noise quiets, and for a moment, they understand what the Frisians have always known, that peace is not the absence of struggle, but the acceptance of rhythm. The same rhythm that turns the tides, that grows the grass, that beats in the human heart. In this endless horizon, the past is not something gone. It is something present. The wind that once filled the sails of Frisian traders now turns the blades of turbines. The water that once threatened their homes now sustains their farms. The songs once sung by fishermen still echo in village festivals. The connection never broke. It simply changed shape, as all living things must. And as night falls over Friesland, the horizon darkens, but it never disappears. It merely waits for the dawn, just as the Frisians have always waited for the next tide, the next season, the next renewal. The stars emerge, bright and patient, reflecting off the still waters. Somewhere far away, a lone bell rings from a village church, its sound drifting across the plains. It is both present and ancient, the heartbeat of a people whose story will never truly end. Because the horizon, like the Frisians themselves, has no end, only continuation. And as the waves roll softly against the shore, the world falls silent once more, listening to a truth as old as the sea itself. Freedom is not a moment. It is a rhythm, and the rhythm of the Frisians still plays on. Now, as the world grows quiet and the last colors of twilight fade into the deep blue of night, Friesland settles into its ancient rhythm once more. The wind eases, the waves calm, and the air carries the cool scent of brine and grass. The stars emerge slowly above the flat horizon, hundreds, then thousands, mirrored perfectly in the still waters of the canals. There is no rush here, no noise, no war between the past and present, only stillness and memory. If you could walk through the night now, down the narrow paths between the fields, you would hear the land breathing, the soft rustle of reeds, the distant cry of a gull, the gentle lap of water against the dikes. Every sound is a reminder that this place, this quiet corner of the world, has never truly changed. It has simply endured. The same wind that cools your face once filled the sails of Frisian ships. The same stars above once guided sailors home through storms. The same rhythm that beats in the waves still beats, quietly, in the hearts of the people who live here. The Frisians are no longer warriors, no longer traders of empire or sailors of conquest. Their battles have changed. They no longer fight kings or conquerors. They fight time itself, the slow erosion of memory in a world that moves too fast. But here, in the hush of the northern night, you realize something profound. They are winning. Not through power or pride, but through peace. Through the simple, stubborn act of remembering. Every farmhouse, every dike, every blade of grass tells their story. The language that once nearly vanished now hums again through classrooms and conversations. Children laugh in Frisian, old songs are sung once more, and the people still look out toward the horizon with the same calm eyes as their ancestors. The old motto still holds true, liever die as slave, better dead than enslaved. But now, it means something softer, something deeper. It is not a cry of battle anymore. It is a whisper of identity, the understanding that true freedom lies in being who you are, quietly, eternally, without need for conquest or praise. As the hours drift past, the world seems to slow with you. The sound of the wind becomes the sound of breathing. The sea becomes the pulse of sleep. The stories of the Frisians, their storms, their kings, their floods and freedoms, begin to blur into something timeless, something vast and comforting. They are not just history anymore. They are rhythm, flowing endlessly through the night like water through the reeds. And as your eyes grow heavy, imagine standing on the edge of that dark sea. The moonlight glimmers across the water, silver and smooth. The waves roll in slow, soft sighs. Somewhere far away, you hear the faint toll of a bell, maybe from a church in Dockham, maybe from a village long lost beneath the sea. The air is cool against your skin. The stars above shimmer like lanterns guiding you home. You take a slow breath. The tide rises, then falls. The world exhales, and you realize that this silence, this peace, this stillness, is the truest legacy of the Frisians. Not war, not wealth, but balance. The balance between water and land, memory and time, freedom and belonging. It is a lesson whispered through centuries, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, until it reaches you, here, now, in the quiet dark. The sea sighs once more, soft and endless. The horizon fades into dream. The story does not end, it simply rests. Because somewhere beyond the waves, beneath the stars, the Frisians still stand watch, guardians of the sea, keepers of the calm. And as you drift into sleep, the North Sea murmurs its lullaby one last time. Freedom endures. Memory lives. And the sea always remembers. The dawn returns, slow, golden, and gentle. It spills over the endless flatlands, brushing the canals and meadows with light. Mist curls along the water's surface, drifting like ghosts of the past that refuse to leave. The first birds begin to sing, and their song carries over the fields, awakening the quiet farms and distant villages. Friesland breathes again. The long night of history fades, and the land awakens to another day, older, wiser, and still beautifully free. It's said that time moves differently here. It doesn't rush or roar. It flows like the tide, steady, patient, eternal. Every sunrise feels connected to the one before it, as if the land itself remembers everything. The battles fought, the floods endured, the languages spoken, the songs sung by candlelight. All of it lingers here in the still air. It's why the Frisians never truly vanished from history. They simply adapted, surviving every storm with quiet strength, their spirit flowing like the rivers that shape their homeland. As you walk through a Frisian village today, it's easy to feel that timelessness. The red brick houses lean gently toward the sea breeze. The church towers still ring out across the fields. In the harbors, the wooden boats rock softly, their ropes creaking, their masts etched with years of salt and wind. Old men sit by the docks, speaking in the same rhythms their ancestors once used. Children chase geese through narrow streets where history hums beneath every cobblestone. Life here moves slowly, beautifully, untouched by the rush of the modern world. And when you stand at the edge of the sea, you can almost hear the echo of those ancient sailors. The Frisians who once set out across the North Sea with nothing but courage, wind, and faith. You can picture their ships, low and wide, sails billowing against the gray sky. You can imagine their laughter, their songs, their prayers whispered into the roaring wind. They are gone, yes, but their presence still lingers, carried on the waves. Every whisper of the tide is their voice, reminding you that freedom isn't a flag or a crown. It's the peace of knowing who you are and never letting the world take that away. The Frisian story isn't one of grand empires or endless wars. It's the story of endurance, of a people who learn to live with the sea, not against it. It's a lesson that echoes through every storm and sunrise, that true strength lies in patience, that quiet defiance can outlast the greatest kingdoms. And as you listen to the waves now, you realize that their legacy is not just history, it's a way of life. So as the light grows brighter and the sound of the sea fades into morning calm, take one last breath with the North Sea wind. Feel the cool air, smell the salt, and listen, truly listen, to the whisper of time flowing past you. The Frisians are still here, their story still alive in every ripple, every gust, every sunrise that touches this endless horizon. And as you drift between waking and dream, their world becomes part of yours, timeless, still, and eternal. Thank you for joining this journey through the history of the Frisians, the sailors, traders, and free people who carved their home between sea and sky. Their legacy reminds us all that even the smallest corner of the world can hold infinite stories, stories of courage, peace, and the enduring power of memory. So, before the day begins, let the calm wash over you one last time. The wind quiets, the water settles, the story rests, and somewhere out there, beneath the same rising sun that once guided their ships home, the Frisians keep watch, guardians of the coast, keepers of the calm, protectors of the past. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, history never truly fades. It only waits to be heard again. The sea never truly sleeps. Even in the calmest hour, when moonlight rests on its surface like silver glass, the waters move beneath, slow, breathing, alive. That's how the spirit of the Frisians endures. It isn't loud or boastful. It doesn't need monuments or empires. It moves quietly, generation after generation, like the tide that shapes their shores. Each wave that breaks on the Wadden Sea carries a fragment of their past, a whisper of a ship that once sailed toward distant lands, a song once sung by a fisherman beneath a pale sky. In the rhythm of the water lies their memory, a pulse that never stops. To listen closely is to hear their history told not in words, but in motion, the eternal dialogue between sea and sand. Long after kings have vanished, long after their banners have turned to dust, the sea remembers. It remembers the hands that built the dikes, the prayers spoken before the storms, the laughter of traders counting coins beneath flickering oil lamps. It remembers the courage of women who guarded homes while the men faced the horizon, and the dreams of children who grew up watching the sails vanish into mist. Every sound, from the cry of a gull to the roll of distant thunder, carries that same melody of endurance. When you walk the coastline at dusk, the air feels heavy with memory. The grass bends low in the wind, the scent of salt clings to your breath, and in that stillness, you understand why they called this land home. The Frisians didn't just live by the sea, they lived with it. They spoke its language. They feared it, loved it, trusted it, for it gave them life, and sometimes it took it away. And yet, they stayed. Through centuries of storms, through floods that swallowed entire villages, they always rebuilt, brick by brick, with hands hardened by the tide. In every wooden boat tied to a dock today, you can still feel that same heartbeat, steady, patient, unyielding. The paint might fade, the sails might tear, but the purpose remains, to face the open sea, no matter what waits beyond. That is what it means to be Frisian, not just to survive, but to belong to something larger, something infinite and untamable. Their story is a circle, not a line. It begins and ends in the same place, where land meets sea, and time folds in on itself. Each generation inherits not just the soil or the language, but the rhythm, the knowledge that freedom, like the tide, must always be defended and renewed. And though centuries have passed since the first Frisian ships set sail, that rhythm still hums beneath the surface of every quiet harbor, every ripple that touches the shore. So tonight, as you listen to the slow breath of the waves, know that you are hearing more than just water. You are hearing the echo of centuries, of voices that refuse to fade, of lives lived in harmony with the world's most powerful force. The sea moves, and so does memory. The tide turns, and with it, the story continues. Because history, like the ocean, never ends. It only changes shape. And as you drift deeper into rest, feel yourself carried by that same eternal motion, the calm, endless rhythm of the Frisians' world. The stars shimmer above the dark water, the wind sighs softly through the dunes, and time itself seems to pause, holding you between the past and the present, between the waking world and the dream. The sea will still be here when you wake, and so will the story,